Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I spent a few months living in my car. It wasn't ideal, but at the time, it was the only thing I could do. I'd just drive out of town, find a secluded spot, and park off the side of the road on some logging road or remote trail. A lot of times I'd sleep in places where I knew no one would bother me. Places that were just far enough from the main road to stay out of sight, but close enough that I wasn't too far from the city when I needed to go back. There was one spot in particular that I started to favor. It was a small gravel pull-off near a patch of woods that wasn't too far from the highway, but it was quiet, almost too quiet. I'd been there a few times before, and nothing ever seemed out of place. It was just another place to park for the night, or so I thought. I felt like I could relax there, maybe even get a decent night's sleep. The first night I stayed there, though, was when things started to get weird. I was lying in my car, trying to sleep, but I was still too wired from the drive to fully settle in. I don't know if it was the exhaustion or just the isolation, but after a while, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. My eyes were closed, but I could almost feel someone out there, standing just outside my car. Then, out of nowhere, it happened. I started having this waking dream, like I was half asleep, but still aware of everything around me. I could see through the darkness, or at least I thought I could, and there was someone out there, just outside my window, looking in. I could almost make out the shape of a person, their face obscured by the shadows. I remember the way my heart pounded in my chest as I froze, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things, but the feeling that someone was there didn't go away. It was so real that I could almost hear their breathing, soft and deliberate, like they were waiting for something. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in place, before the feeling passed. But when it did, I immediately jumped up, pulled the car door open, and looked around. Nothing. Not a sound. Not a movement. The night was still, just as it had been when I first parked. But I couldn't shake the feeling. It stayed with me for the rest of the night, keeping me awake and on edge, even though I knew there was no one out there. The next few days, I parked in other places. I didn't want to go back to that spot. It was too weird, too unsettling. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about that shadowy figure outside my car, staring in. It was just a nightmare, right? A trick of my mind. Maybe, but it still felt off. But after a few nights, I found myself back at the same spot. I don't even know why. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe I thought it was just a fluke, that nothing would happen this time. It was a place I had come to know, a place that was still close to the city, but far enough to be quiet. I thought I could ignore the weirdness and get some rest. That night, though, the nightmares came back. This time, they were worse. I woke up again and again, feeling like someone was outside my car, trying to get in. The pressure on the door handle, the muffled sound of footsteps around my vehicle, the soft scraping noises against the side of my car, it all felt so real. Each time I woke up, my heart was racing, and I would pull myself together, tell myself it was just a dream. But it wasn't just a dream. It was like I could feel someone out there. It was like I was being watched. After the second night of these horrible dreams, I finally had enough. I couldn't deal with it anymore. It was as if the place had a bad energy, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I was done. I avoided that spot for weeks, parking anywhere but there. But eventually, it all caught up to me. I was driving one afternoon, and I was so tired. I hadn't had a proper sleep in days, and all I wanted was to find somewhere quiet to nap. That familiar spot popped into my mind, and for some stupid reason, I decided to go back. Maybe I thought the nightmares were just my nerves or stress, but I didn't think it would be so bad. I pulled into the gravel pull-off, the same spot I'd parked before. The air was still and warm, and there wasn't a soul in sight. I sat in the car for a minute, just collecting myself, then lay down on the passenger seat with my seat reclined, trying to get comfortable. I hadn't been lying there more than 10 minutes when I heard a noise. A rustling sound, coming from the brush just beyond the clearing. It was soft at first, almost like the wind moving through the trees, but then I heard it more clearly, footsteps. The crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I sat up, my heart immediately starting to race. I told myself it was just a hiker or someone else passing through, but the noise was getting closer. And then, just as I was about to check it out, I saw him. A guy on a bicycle, riding down the dirt trail that cut through the woods. He came out of the trees, pedaling slowly, wearing a filthy jacket and a pair of well-worn jeans. His bicycle looked like it had seen better days, with a rusty frame and one of the tires low on air. He was heading straight toward my car, not looking around or giving any sign that he had noticed me. He wasn't even going fast, like he didn't have a care in the world. I recognized him immediately. He was someone I had seen around town before, a homeless guy who was always walking through the streets, pushing a cart or picking through trash cans for bottles and cans. He had a reputation for hanging around the outskirts of town, looking for anything that could be of use. I knew he had to live somewhere out in the bush, near the logging roads. It wasn't unusual to see him out here, but something about him showing up right near my car freaked me out. It felt too much like I wasn't supposed to be here anymore. He rode past my car, not even glancing in my direction. I stayed completely still, not wanting to draw attention to myself. As he passed, I saw the worn-out backpack slung across his shoulders, bulging with something. Maybe more bottles, or maybe just his things. He didn't seem like someone who had a place to stay, and that was unsettling in itself. He was living out here, too, in the same woods that felt so damn empty, so eerie, when the sun went down. I watched as he pedaled away, disappearing back into the trees. And for some reason, that was when everything hit me. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest. I didn't know what it was exactly, but suddenly, the place felt wrong. It wasn't just that someone else was out there, someone who probably didn't want to be found. It was the realization that I had been alone, truly alone, up until that point, and now I wasn't anymore. The quiet I had found so comforting before felt oppressive now. I couldn't shake the image of that guy coming out of the woods, moving through the trees, as if he knew them better than anyone else. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. I started the engine, barely able to control the shaking in my hands. I glanced back at the spot where the guy had ridden off, but it was empty now. Nothing seemed out of place, but my mind couldn't stop racing. The car felt like a prison, like I was stuck in the exact spot where all the weirdness had started. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing out there, but I wasn't willing to stick around to find out. I drove off quickly, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror as I left. I kept looking for any signs that I was being followed, but all I saw was the empty road stretching out ahead of me. I drove for what felt like hours, trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, I pulled into another random parking spot, far from where I had been. I found a small gas station and parked behind it, out of sight from the main road. I didn't want to be near the logging roads anymore. Not after that guy had shown up. Not after everything that had happened in that place. The isolation had felt comforting before, but now it felt suffocating. That night, I slept in my car with the doors locked, eyes darting around at every sound. I knew I couldn't keep running from the fear, but at least for that night, I didn't feel completely alone. The roads that once felt like my escape now felt like the beginning of something I didn't fully understand. I think if I ever tried to explain my life to someone, they wouldn't even believe me. It sounds too extreme, too strange, too disturbing to be real. But it was real, every single part of it. I lived it. I woke up in it every day and went to sleep in it every night, trapped in a kind of life that felt more like a prison sentence than a home. From the time I was little, my mother and grandmother were always there, hovering, watching, deciding every part of my life for me. It wasn't the kind of thing where a kid is just sheltered. It went way beyond that. I wasn't allowed to walk down the street by myself, not even to the corner. I wasn't allowed to visit friends or even distant family. I wasn't allowed outside alone. I couldn't cook for myself, couldn't even turn on the oven. I wasn't allowed to use sharp knives, or clean without supervision, or go anywhere without someone breathing down my neck. And they said it was because they loved me. That's what they always said, every time I tried to ask why. They said the world was too dangerous. That if I so much as stepped foot outside the house alone, someone would snatch me away or hurt me. And I believed them for a long time, because when that's all you hear growing up, it just seeps into your bones. You don't know anything else. But as I got older, it didn't get better. It got worse. By the time I was a teenager, it was humiliating. Other kids were getting jobs, driving cars, staying out late, going to parties. I couldn't even walk to the mailbox without my mother standing on the porch like a guard dog, watching my every move. She would even come into the bathroom sometimes just to make sure I wasn't up to something. When I turned 19, most people my age were either in college or working, building their lives, making friends, figuring out who they wanted to be. I was still trapped inside that same suffocating house, with my mother and grandmother watching my every step. I wasn't allowed to get a job. I wasn't allowed to even apply. My mother told me over and over that I had everything I needed right there with her. That money was dangerous, that working was dangerous. The worst part was she truly believed it. She didn't think she was hurting me. She thought she was protecting me from the world. But it didn't feel like protection. It felt like being buried alive. It wasn't like I could argue with her either. If I so much as raised my voice, she would fly into a rage, screaming that I was ungrateful, that I didn't appreciate everything she did for me, that I was breaking her heart. Guilt was her favorite weapon. Guilt and fear. And when those didn't work, she would just take away whatever small freedoms I had left, like removing a chair from a birdcage. I don't even know when the thought first formed in my mind that I had to get out. I think it was always there, somewhere deep down. But it took a long time for it to grow strong enough to act on. I had no money, no friends, no ID, no driver's license. I didn't even know how to get on a bus. I didn't know how to survive in the world because they had made sure I didn't. But I wasn't stupid. I started saving up change wherever I could find it. Doing laundry was my main chance. My grandmother's clothes, my mother's clothes, sometimes they'd leave a few coins in the pockets. A quarter here, a dime there. I'd swipe it so carefully and hide it in a little hole I'd carved into the back of my closet behind a loose board. I couldn't let them find it. My mother believed all money in the house belonged to her, no matter where it came from. If she ever found any in my possession, she'd take it, yelling that I was stealing from her. She said money was evil, that it would only lead me into danger, that I didn't need it. It took me almost a year to save enough to even think about leaving. I packed a small bag, just the basics, things I hoped she wouldn't notice missing for a while. I planned everything out in secret. I studied the local bus routes at night when she and my grandmother were asleep, using an old, battered computer they didn't know how to check. I figured out how to walk to the station without being seen. The day I tried to leave, I thought my heart was going to explode out of my chest. Every step toward the door felt like walking through mud. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my bag. I made it to the front porch before she noticed. I heard the shout behind me, the raw, furious sound of my name being screamed. I tried to run, but I wasn't fast enough. She tackled me from behind, grabbing my shirt and pulling me down hard onto the concrete. My bag went flying. I remember the scrape of the porch against my knees, the sharp jolt of pain up my arms. Before I could even try to scramble up, she was on top of me, shouting, crying, begging, hitting. My grandmother came hobbling out of the house a few seconds later and helped her drag me inside. They locked the doors. They took my bag. They took my phone. My mother even called the phone company and reported it stolen so that they could shut it off, just in case I tried to call for help. That night, she slept beside my bed. Not in it, beside it, on the floor, with a pillow and a blanket like some kind of jailer. She stayed awake most of the night, just staring at me, making sure I didn't sneak out again. After that, things got even worse. She started dragging me to church more often. We didn't just attend services anymore. She took me to these special meetings. Holiness meetings, she called them, where she told the preachers that I was possessed, that demons were living inside me and trying to drag me away from the light. I had to stand there for hours while they screamed prayers at me, laying their hands on me, shaking me, ordering the demons to leave. It was hell. Nobody helped me. Nobody even seemed to think it was strange. They all just nodded along with her, believing everything she said, looking at me like I was some broken thing that needed to be fixed. I kept trying to plan my escape, but it got harder and harder. She was watching me constantly now. She barely let me out of her sight. If I so much as went into another room, she would follow a minute later, pretending she needed to clean or talk or pray with me. Weeks went by, then months. I thought I was going to go insane. Then, by some miracle, I managed to save up enough money again. I found a hidden pocket of change in an old jewelry box, money my grandmother must have forgotten about. I didn't dare take it all at once. I took a few coins at a time carefully, so they wouldn't notice. I bought a bus ticket online, using a fake email address. I packed another bag, even smaller this time, and I waited for the right moment. I thought I had it all figured out. But she wasn't stupid. The day I was supposed to leave, my cousin showed up out of nowhere. She acted like she just wanted to visit, to talk, to catch up. I hadn't seen her in months, and even though something in my gut told me it was wrong, I was desperate. I wanted someone to talk to, someone to tell everything to. She asked if I wanted to go for a ride, just to get out of the house for a while. She said she understood. She said she would help me. I believed her. I was desperate enough to believe anyone at that point. The second I got into her car, she hit the child safety lock and smiled at me like she had just won some kind of prize. She drove me straight back home. My mother was waiting on the porch. They kept me isolated after that. Completely. I wasn't allowed outside at all anymore. They took the doorknobs off my bedroom door and replaced them with locks they could control from the outside. They even parked relatives' cars in the driveway so that I couldn't sneak off with one of them if I ever managed to get outside. The windows were nailed shut. The internet was cut off. I wasn't even allowed to open the mailbox anymore. An entire year passed like that. I stopped keeping track of time because it hurt too much. Every day was the same. Every night was the same. I woke up, I was watched. I ate, I was watched. I slept, I was watched. I existed, and that was all. But somewhere deep down inside, a small, stubborn part of me refused to die. I started exercising secretly, building my strength. I started memorizing the sounds of the house, how the floors creaked, how the doors squealed, where the shadows fell at different times of day. And when the opportunity finally came, I was ready. It was late. My grandmother had fallen asleep in her recliner. My mother was in the kitchen, talking loudly on the phone. The back door, left unlocked by mistake. I didn't even think. I just moved. Quiet, fast, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I grabbed my bag, slipped out the door, and ran. I ran until my legs gave out. Then I crawled. Then I staggered to my feet and ran some more. I didn't stop until I reached the bus station, miles away, battered and filthy and gasping for air. I used the money I had hidden in my shoes to buy a ticket. I didn't care where it went. Anywhere was better than where I had been. It wasn't easy after that. It was terrifying. I had nothing. No ID, no home, no real knowledge of the world. But I was free. And little by little, I built a life for myself. I got help from a shelter first. They helped me get proper identification, helped me find a job in a kitchen washing dishes. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, learning everything from scratch, trying to live in a world that I had only seen through windows. But every day I woke up and chose to keep going. Every day I woke up and chose not to go back. I moved into a tiny studio apartment after a few months. No furniture, just a mattress on the floor. It was heaven to me. I could walk to the store whenever I wanted. I could make my own dinner. I could watch the sunset without someone breathing down my neck. I could just be. It wasn't perfect. I had nightmares for a long time. I still sometimes do. But I built something real for myself, piece by piece, out of the rubble they left me with. And even now, after everything, I know one thing for certain. No matter what else happens in my life, no matter how hard things get, I will never let anyone lock me away again. I earned my freedom with blood and bone, and I will never give it up. I remember it was a warm afternoon, not too hot, but just that perfect kind of day where you could stay outside for hours without getting tired. The air smelled like grass and dirt, and the sun was shining through the trees that lined the little neighborhood we lived in. It was a quiet area, kind of out in the country, not a lot of cars, not a lot of people. Mostly just families who had been there for years. Everybody kind of knew everybody else. I was about 9 or 10 years old then. I had gone over to my friend's house after lunch, the way I usually did when the weather was nice. There were 3 of us out there, me and my 2 friends, just messing around in the yard. I think we were playing some made-up game, something like tag mixed with hide and seek, where we'd sprint around the big trees and try to dodge each other. Their yard was big, with patches of tall grass along the edges and an old swing set that squeaked every time we used it. Their house sat back from the road a little, with a long gravel driveway. You could always hear when a car went by because the sound of the tires on the gravel road echoed through the trees. At first, we didn't think anything about the truck. It was just this old beat-up truck, kind of a dirty green color, with rust spots on the sides and a loud rattling engine. It passed by while we were running around near the swing set. We heard it coming and looked up for just a second, out of habit more than anything else. It drove past slow, not crawling, but slower than cars normally went. Then it was gone. We didn't think much about it. But then it came back. It was about 5 minutes later. We were still playing, maybe chasing each other around the tree closest to the driveway, when we heard the sound again. The tires crunching, the engine grumbling low. We all stopped moving for a second and looked toward the road. Same truck, same dirty green color, same rusty sides. Only this time, the truck slowed down even more when it passed by, almost to a roll. It felt weird, the way it just kind of floated by like that, almost like the guy was waiting for something. I remember my stomach tightening a little, that tiny first feeling that something wasn't right, but being a kid, I kind of brushed it off. Maybe he was just lost or looking for somebody's house. We tried to ignore it and went back to playing, but the game wasn't as fun anymore. We were all kind of distracted, our heads half turned toward the road, listening. Sure enough, a few minutes later, we heard it again. Tires crunching, engine rattling. We all froze where we were, and this time we watched more carefully. The truck slowed way down, right in front of the driveway. It was close enough that I could see the driver's face through the windshield. He was an older man, maybe in his 50s or 60s, with thinning gray hair and a big mustache. He had a rough face, the kind that looked like it had been out in the sun too long. But what made my blood run cold was that he was holding something up in his hand. At first, I thought it was maybe a phone or a walkie-talkie, but then I realized what it was. It was one of those old camcorders, the kind people used to have before phones could record. He was holding it up and pointing it directly at us as he drove by, filming us. None of us said anything. We just stared at him as he passed. His truck barely moved, and it felt like he was looking right at us through that little screen. I remember my heart hammering in my chest, my mouth going dry. We didn't even move until he had gone around the curve at the end of the road and out of sight. Without even talking about it, we all bolted straight into the house. Their door slammed shut behind us, and we stood there in the kitchen panting, trying to process what just happened. Their mom was in the back room doing laundry or something, so one of my friends grabbed the house phone and called her over. When she came into the kitchen and we told her what happened, she didn't seem as freaked out as we were, but her face did get kind of tight, and she told my friends they needed to stay inside for the rest of the afternoon. Then she turned to me and said I should go home. I remember just standing there, feeling my heart sink into my stomach. I tried to tell her that my mom wasn't home, that she had gone to town to run errands and wouldn't be back for a while, but it didn't seem to matter. She just repeated that I should go. I guess in her mind, I lived close enough that it wouldn't be a big deal. The road between their house and mine wasn't very long if you were in a car, but it felt like a whole different story on foot, especially for a kid. It was probably a mile, maybe 2, and it was one of those country roads with no sidewalks, just gravel and weeds on either side. The trees on either side of the road were thick, the branches reaching overhead and making long shadows. There weren't a lot of houses between mine and theirs, and sometimes a quarter mile would go by without seeing a driveway. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, wishing she would change her mind. But she didn't. So finally I opened the door and stepped outside. The late afternoon sun was still shining, but it didn't feel warm anymore. It felt cold against my skin. I looked both ways down the road. I didn't see the truck. I didn't see anything, but my gut was screaming at me to move fast. I started walking at first, but after about 20 steps, my nerves got the better of me, and I broke into a run. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. My shoes slapped against the gravel, sending little rocks flying. My backpack bounced against my shoulders, and my heart thudded so hard I thought it might burst right through my chest. The whole time, my ears were straining for the sound of that rattling engine. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I kept seeing images in my head of the green truck coming around the bend behind me, of it pulling up alongside me, the man reaching out and grabbing me. My legs burned from running, but I didn't slow down. I ran past the big oak tree that marked the halfway point between our houses. I ran past the little ditch where we used to catch frogs after it rained. I didn't even look back. I didn't want to know if he was behind me. The road curved near the end, and for a horrible second, I thought I saw something green out of the corner of my eye. I stumbled a little, almost falling, but when I looked properly, it was just a tractor sitting in a field, abandoned and half-rusted. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, until I finally saw the mailbox that meant home was just up the driveway. I tore up the driveway, gravel digging into my shoes, and slammed through the front door without even bothering to knock or call out. Inside, the house felt way too quiet. My mom still wasn't home. The kitchen light was off, the living room empty. I locked the door behind me and stood there panting, listening. I went around and locked every window, every door. I even closed all the curtains, even though it was still daylight. I huddled on the floor behind the couch, peeking out through a tiny gap in the curtain, watching the road. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Probably 30 minutes, maybe more. Every time I heard a car, I held my breath, waiting to see if it was the truck. But it never was. Eventually, I heard my mom's car pull into the driveway. I ran out the door before she even turned off the ignition. She looked surprised to see me, but when she saw my face, her smile faded fast. I spilled the whole story out at once, barely able to get the words out through the tears and the gasps for breath. She was furious, not at me, but at my friend's mom for sending me home alone. She kept saying over and over again how lucky I was, how stupid it was to let a kid walk alone after something like that had happened. I could tell she was holding back from yelling, just because she didn't want to scare me more. She made a bunch of phone calls that night. First to the sheriff's department, then to my friend's mom, then to some neighbors. I heard bits and pieces of the conversations. Apparently, they sent a deputy out to patrol the area for a few days, but nobody ever saw the green truck again. My mom drove me everywhere for a long time after that, even just down the road. She sat me down that night and told me what to do if anything like that ever happened again. To scream, to run to the nearest house, even if it wasn't ours, even if I didn't know the people. To never, ever walk alone if something felt wrong. After that, things slowly went back to normal, but it was never quite the same. I didn't go over to my friend's house as much anymore, and when I did, my mom would walk me there herself or pick me up. I guess part of being a kid is thinking you're safe just because you're small and the world feels familiar. That day was the first time I realized that sometimes bad things can sneak into quiet places too. I never saw the man in the green truck again. Maybe he realized we noticed him and got scared off. Maybe he was just passing through. But even now, years later, every time I hear tires crunching on gravel, part of me tenses up, waiting for that old rattling engine to come around the bend again. It didn't ruin my childhood or anything like that. I still had a lot of good days outside with my friends, but it taught me something important. It taught me to listen to that little voice in my gut when something feels wrong. It taught me that being cautious isn't the same as being scared. And it taught me that not everyone in the world has good intentions, no matter how quiet the place you live might seem. Some things you don't forget. And that day, that run home, is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. I used to work at a church as the head sound engineer. The majority of my job was active during the day for the Sunday services, setting up the sound systems, making sure everything worked perfectly for the sermons and music. But occasionally, there were tasks that I could do whenever I got the chance. One of these tasks was duplicating CDs of the sermons for people who wanted to listen to them later, whether in the car, at home, or during the week. I'd get requests for a single sermon or sometimes entire sermon series, which would take hours to duplicate. The church had a modest sound system, but duplicating CDs could take up to 45 minutes per disc, depending on how long the sermon was. Since I was a night owl and had a flexible schedule, I often went in at odd hours to take care of these duplication requests. I liked the peace and quiet of the church at night. There was something serene about being in such a large building with nobody around. The key I had allowed me to get in and out at any time. It didn't bother me at all to be there in the middle of the night. Something about the routine, the solitude, the familiarity of the space made it feel safe, almost comforting. The church was situated in a quiet, small town with no real danger around, and after working there for so long, I felt like I knew the place better than the back of my hand. One night, I headed into the church around 1 or 2 in the morning. I didn't bother turning on any lights because I knew my way around well enough. The dim light from the streetlights outside filtered through the windows just enough for me to see, but the interior was pitch black otherwise. I had grown so accustomed to it that I didn't even think twice about being in the dark. The layout of the church was simple. There was the foyer, which led into the sanctuary, where the services were held. The sanctuary had a balcony that overlooked the pews below. It was from this balcony that the sound booth was located. There was only one way up to the balcony, a staircase in the foyer. The door to the balcony could be locked from the inside, and it always was when I was up there. The sound booth held the CD duplicator and all the necessary audio equipment. The whole place had a kind of acoustic harmony to it. The sound carried well, and from the balcony, you could hear everything that happened on stage with perfect clarity. That night, I headed straight up to the balcony, flipping on a single light above my head as I began setting up the duplicator. It was a small, dim bulb, not bright enough to light up the whole sanctuary, but enough for me to see what I was doing. The sanctuary below was dark, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful. The air was thick with the kind of silence that only a church at night could have. I lost myself in the task of duplicating CDs, absorbed in the low hum of the machine. Time slipped away unnoticed. After about an hour of working, I was startled by a sound. It came from below, from the sanctuary. A soft clink-clink. It was unmistakable to me. It sounded like ceramic mugs clinking together. It wasn't a loud sound, just soft enough to make me stop what I was doing. I paused, listening. The sound repeated, but there was no mistaking it. The clinking was coming from somewhere in the pews below me, on the left-hand side, about 20 to 30 feet away. It wasn't the kind of sound you could ignore. I knew exactly what that sound was. We had a coffee house area in the church where people could grab coffee and donuts before and after services. The mugs they used were ceramic, the kind you'd find in any kitchen, nothing special. But because there were so many of them floating around the church, and they were frequently picked up by volunteers to be washed, you could always hear them clinking together as they were gathered up. It was a background noise during services, almost like a part of the church's routine. So hearing that familiar clink in the dead of night, when I knew I was the only one in the church, struck me as odd. I stood there in the sound booth, trying to make sense of it. There was no reason for ceramic mugs to be clinking together in an empty sanctuary in the middle of the night. I knew the layout of the church well enough to know that there were likely a few mugs left behind after services, but nothing that would account for this sound. The noise persisted for a few more seconds, then stopped. I waited, listening carefully. Nothing. For a moment, I was ready to shrug it off as my imagination. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided I needed to figure out where it was coming from. I descended the stairs to the foyer and flipped on all the light switches. The sanctuary was suddenly bathed in harsh fluorescent light, and I walked into the sanctuary, scanning the pews. I immediately focused on the area where I had heard the sound. Nothing seemed out of place. The pews were as I expected, clean, still, untouched by any cleaning crew. It was midweek, and nobody had been in here since Sunday. I knew there would likely be a few mugs scattered about from the coffee house, so I decided to check the floor beneath the pews, as that's where people often left their mugs. I crouched down in the front rows, peering under the pews. From this angle, I could see every pew on both sides of the sanctuary. Sure enough, I spotted a few mugs scattered across the floor. They were all a few feet away from each other, some near the center, some near the sides. But none of them were close enough to make the sound I'd heard. It was impossible for them to clink together. I checked each mug carefully. None of them were touching. None of them were in a position to make any noise on their own. Frustrated, I stood up and walked through the rows, checking every last mug. There was no logical reason for the sound, but I had to rule out every possibility. I found no mugs that could explain it. I decided to brush it off, though I couldn't shake the unease in the pit of my stomach. I turned off the lights in the sanctuary and headed back up to the balcony. The faint hum of the duplicator machine the only sound filling the air again. I didn't get much more time to settle into my work before the sound came again. Clink, clink. My heart stopped for a moment. It was the same sound, in the same spot. I froze, staring out into the empty sanctuary below. It didn't make any sense. I had just been down there. There were no mugs close enough to create that sound. I didn't want to overreact, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I rushed back down the stairs, flipped all the lights back on, and entered the sanctuary again. I got down on my hands and knees, scanning the floor under the pews once more. Nothing had changed. There were no mugs in any position to make that sound. I had verified it myself. There was no logical explanation. By now, I was thoroughly spooked, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. I decided to leave one light on in the sanctuary as I headed back up to the balcony, trying to calm my nerves. The silence in the building was oppressive, but I pushed through. I locked the door at the top of the stairs, securing myself in the sound booth. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I wasn't going to let myself get paranoid over it. I was alone in the church at night all the time, and nothing ever happened. I was in the middle of duplicating another CD when it happened again. Clink, clink. This time, the sound was louder, more pronounced. It echoed through the empty room like it was mocking me. I stood up, scanning the sanctuary from my perch. There was no one down there. Nothing moved. Nothing out of place. I felt a cold sweat start to form on my back as I stared down, my mind racing for an explanation that didn't involve something supernatural or absurd. I couldn't come up with anything that made sense. I told myself to focus on the task at hand. I went back to the duplicator, trying to ignore the sounds. But they kept coming, each one louder and more frequent than the last. Clink, clink. Clink, clink, clink. It wasn't stopping. I could hear it as clearly as I heard the whirring of the CD machine. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I went downstairs, turned off the light in the sanctuary, and then, feeling a little braver, went back to the sound booth. I left the door unlocked this time, but I didn't think anything of it. The night was dragging on, and I just wanted to finish my work and get out of there. Then, everything changed. Without warning, the entire sanctuary began to shake violently, as though it had been hit by some tremendous force. The room rattled as though there was an earthquake, but I knew there hadn't been one. The soundboard in front of me was flashing red, the LEDs maxed out, indicating some kind of overload. But there was no sound coming from the speakers, no equipment turned on that could have caused this. I could feel the rumble beneath me, the bass reverberating through the floor, as if the building itself were alive, angry even. The air in the sanctuary felt thick, charged, as though something was trying to make itself known. The rumbling lasted no more than 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it stopped, everything went dead silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I didn't stick around to see if it would happen again. I grabbed my things, bolted out of the church, and drove home as fast as I could. I couldn't explain it. I tried to rationalize it, but nothing made sense. There were no explanations for the sounds, no logical reason for the church to shake like that. But I knew one thing for sure. I never went back there at night after that. And I never wanted to experience anything like that again. Some things don't need explanations. Some things just leave you with a feeling that you'll never shake off. I arrived at the hotel in the New Forest with a large group of friends, all excited for the weekend away. The place was charming in its own right, a large, imposing building with the kind of character that only time can bestow. It had been converted from a hunting lodge into a hotel, but you could tell the bones of the place were old. The wooden beams, the long hallways, the creaky floors, and the stone fireplaces all told stories of another time. The air in the lobby was thick with a musty smell, the kind that comes from old wood and the dampness of centuries of storms, but there was a sort of allure to it. Maybe it was the history that surrounded the place, or maybe it was the old world charm that made me feel as though I was stepping back into a different era. I checked in and was shown to my room. As soon as the door swung open, a wave of discomfort washed over me. It wasn't anything that could be easily pinpointed. It wasn't the decor, the size, or the general condition of the room. It was something intangible, something I couldn't put into words. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt like I wasn't alone, even though I was. It was an unsettling sensation, the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was simply the excitement of being in an unfamiliar place. But that didn't stop the creeping unease from sinking deeper into my bones. The room itself was large, with high ceilings that made the space feel even bigger than it already was. The bed was dressed in old-fashioned linens that looked as though they had been chosen specifically for their vintage charm. The windows were tall, with thick curtains that were drawn shut, but I could see faint traces of light filtering through the gaps. The air was damp and heavy, and the silence in the room was almost oppressive. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment, just breathing, trying to make sense of the unease. It was as though I was being watched, but no one was there. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling as nothing more than an overactive imagination. The group I was with was meeting downstairs for a welcome drink, and I was eager to get out of the room. I gathered my things and left, closing the door behind me with a quiet click. Dinner that night was a casual affair in the hotel's dining room. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, and the conversation flowed easily. But even in the middle of all the noise and laughter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The laughter of my friends felt distant, like I was hearing it from the other side of a thick wall. The clinking of glasses, the scraping of chairs on the floor, the chatter of the other guests. It all felt muffled, as though the hotel itself was swallowing up the sounds. I tried to push it aside, telling myself that I was just tired, that I needed a good night's sleep. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I went back to my room after dinner, my mind still swirling with an inexplicable sense of dread. I tried to push it out of my mind and focused on settling in for the night. I turned on the bedside lamp, but even the soft yellow glow of the light seemed to make the room feel smaller, more oppressive. The shadows cast by the furniture stretched long across the walls, and I felt trapped, unable to escape the feeling that I was being watched. I went to bed, but it wasn't long before the discomfort began to escalate. I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of the history of the hotel, of the countless people who had stayed here before me. The idea of being in a place so steeped in history should have been exciting, but instead, it made my skin crawl. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something dark, something that I couldn't see, but could sense with every fiber of my being. For the first time in my adult life, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. I lay there in the bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I kept the lamp on, the soft light casting long shadows across the room. Every creak of the building, every distant sound, made me jump. It felt like the walls were closing in around me, and the air was too thick to breathe properly. I thought about the history of the place again, the hunting lodge, the military hospital during World War I, and I couldn't shake the thought that perhaps there was more to the building's past than I had been told. But I pushed those thoughts away, too, convinced that my mind was simply playing tricks on me. At some point, I finally drifted into a fitful sleep. But the dreams that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced before. They were vivid, so vivid that I could feel the cold of the earth beneath me, the weight of my body pressed down by the mud, the sound of explosions ringing in my ears. I was in a trench, somewhere in the midst of the Great War. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and death, and all around me, the earth shook with the constant banging of artillery. I could hear the screams of men, fellow soldiers, echoing in the distance, and the sound of shells whizzing overhead was deafening. The fear, the confusion, the utter hopelessness of it all was so real that I could almost taste it. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The feeling of terror lingered, and for a moment, I didn't know where I was. The room was dark, save for the faint light filtering through the curtains. I could hear the wind howling outside, but there was no sound of explosions, no distant screams. I felt disoriented, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I struggled to calm myself. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as though someone was standing just out of sight, watching me. I sat up in bed, my mind racing, and then I heard it, a faint banging sound. It was distant, but it was there, coming from somewhere within the hotel. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but the sound was rhythmic, like something metal was being struck, almost like roofing panels shifting in the wind. I lay there, frozen, the fear gripping me once again. The dream, the sensations of being in that trench, were still fresh in my mind. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, unable to escape. The banging continued, growing louder with each passing moment, until it felt like it was coming from right outside my door. I couldn't take it anymore. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up, the cold floor beneath my feet sending a shock through my body. I walked to the door and cracked it open, just enough to peer into the hallway. It was empty. No one was there. I closed the door again, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I couldn't get back to sleep. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of the hotel's past, of the soldiers who had been treated there during the war. It felt like I was being drawn into something far darker than I was prepared for. The rest of the night passed in a haze, and when morning finally came, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I went downstairs for breakfast, hoping that a cup of coffee would help clear my mind. The dining room was filled with the chatter of my friends, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced around the room, trying to ignore the strange sense of isolation that had settled over me. It wasn't until I spotted a framed photograph on the wall that I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise again. The photo showed the hotel, taken sometime in the early 20th century. Below it was a plaque that told the story of how the hotel had been converted into a military hospital during World War I. The story was detailed, describing the treatment of wounded soldiers and the hospital's role in the war effort. I stared at the plaque, my mind racing. I hadn't known anything about the hotel's history before I arrived, but now it all seemed to make sense. The dreams, the fear, the sense of being watched, it all lined up. It was as though the building was holding on to something that had seeped into the very walls and floors. I couldn't stay in my room any longer. I left and found a friend, and together, we moved to another room. The atmosphere didn't improve, though. The sense of dread never left me. My friend, too, admitted that they felt it, the oppressive weight of something unseen. We stayed together in that room, and even though we tried to laugh it off, neither of us could deny the strange, uncomfortable feeling that lingered in the air. The rest of the stay was a blur of uneasy glances and whispered conversations. The hotel's history weighed heavily on my mind, but it wasn't until I left that I realized just how much it had affected me. The feeling of being watched, the vivid nightmares, the sense of being trapped, it all felt too real, too close. I'll never know what caused it, whether it was the hotel's past or something more mundane. But one thing is certain, I'll never forget the feeling of being in that room, alone in the dark, unable to escape the sensation that something was waiting just out of sight. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a quick getaway. My best friend Jess, her boyfriend James, and I were headed out to Sumter National Forest for a weekend of fun. I had been looking forward to it all week, ready for some peace and quiet, and maybe a few scares from the rain, which seemed to be a permanent fixture in the forecast. We pulled into the park just before sundown. The forest was dense, the trees pressing in close to the road as we turned off and found a secluded spot far from any other campers. The weather had been steady, drizzling lightly for hours, the kind of rain that makes everything feel damp but never really soaks you. I didn't mind. It added to the vibe of the place, the dark and quiet woods, the constant low hum of the rain. It was peaceful until it wasn't. After we set up camp, we decided it would be best to sleep in the SUV. Jess had a bad back and didn't want to sleep on the ground, and I wasn't about to argue. The SUV felt safe and secure, and honestly, I was getting the sense that something wasn't quite right about this place. It was too quiet, too isolated. The rain pattered on the roof, soothing in its consistency, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Jess, who was always the more laid-back of the three of us, didn't seem to notice. She was focused on her phone, chatting with people back home. James, on the other hand, kept glancing out the windows, his brow furrowed. His unease was palpable, but he didn't say anything about it. It was just a feeling we both shared, though neither of us voiced it. I had brought along a book, one I had read countless times before, scary stories to tell in the dark. As the rain continued to fall, we began reading aloud from it, laughing nervously at some of the stories. The atmosphere around us seemed to shift. The combination of the book's eerie tales and the incessant rain made everything feel a little more unsettling than it should have been. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I could see something out there, just past the glow of the SUV's headlights. After an hour or so, we turned off the lights and decided it was time to go to sleep. It wasn't quite midnight, but the darkness of the forest made it feel like it was much later. We all settled into our seats, trying to get comfortable, the rain continuing its steady beat on the roof of the SUV. That's when I first heard it, the sound that would haunt me for weeks after. It started as a soft, faint rustling noise, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. But as it continued, it became clearer. It was a steady pattern, like footsteps in the wet grass outside, moving back and forth in a deliberate way. I thought I was imagining it at first, but then Jess and James both stiffened, both of them hearing it too. I held my breath, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was too regular, too purposeful to be an animal, and the rhythm didn't match anything that I could place. My mind started to race. Could it be another camper? Someone else who had gotten lost in the dark and was walking around the campsite? Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon or some other forest animal. But none of those explanations felt right. It wasn't random, like an animal would move. It was too human. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I bothered to speak. I knew they both heard it too. Jess nodded but didn't say anything. She seemed unnerved, which was rare for her. James, ever the more cautious of the two, was already turning on the headlights of the SUV. The sudden light cut through the darkness outside, casting long shadows on the trees that surrounded us. I couldn't help but feel exposed in that moment. Whatever was out there, now knew we were awake. Then, through the trees on the right side of the car, I saw it. A movement, something large and dark shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a shape moving through the rain-soaked underbrush. My pulse quickened. It wasn't a bear or a deer. It was too big for that, and the way it moved felt too deliberate, too human. Before I could say anything, James grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. "I'll go check it out," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "James, no," I said, panic rising in my chest. But he was already out of the car, shining the flashlight into the trees. We watched as he walked into the woods, the beam of light bouncing over the wet ground, casting strange shadows along the trees. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, but I couldn't stop him. He was always the brave one, the one who thought it was just a harmless animal or some other explanation. I looked at Jess, and she was already trembling. "He's going to get himself hurt," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I knew she was right, but I didn't know what to do. I could hardly breathe, let alone think straight. We watched as James continued to move into the woods, the light from his flashlight bobbing in and out of sight. He made it about 20 yards before we heard him scream, "Go! Go! Go!" The fear in his voice was like nothing I had ever heard before. Jess and I didn't waste any time. She slammed the car into reverse, and I grabbed the gear shift, helping her maneuver the SUV away from the trees. We were speeding down the narrow dirt road in seconds, the headlights flashing on the wet trees as we tore through the forest. Then, just as we turned onto the main road, I saw it. A figure, bursting out from the tree line behind us. I didn't get a good look, but I knew enough. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was covered in filthy, tattered rags, his body hunched forward in a strange, animalistic way. His face, God, I can still see it now, was unrecognizable. It was twisted, almost like it had been burned or mangled. His eyes glowed in the light, wide and wild. James had turned the flashlight toward him, but the moment he did, the man locked eyes with him. Without warning, the figure started running toward us, moving faster than I thought possible, even for a person. He moved with a disturbing, unnatural speed, his limbs jerking in ways that didn't seem right. "Go!" James screamed again, his voice shaking. We didn't need any more prompting. Jess slammed the accelerator to the floor, and the SUV shot down the road, the sound of the tires splashing through the rain deafening in my ears. I could still hear that man, or whatever it was, getting closer, the sound of footsteps crunching through the wet ground. But eventually, the figure disappeared into the darkness. We didn't stop until we were miles away, our nerves frayed, our bodies shaking with adrenaline. We found the first safe place we could, a Piggly Wiggly parking lot in the middle of nowhere. The lights of the store were a stark contrast to the inky blackness of the forest, and I felt a strange sense of safety under the bright fluorescent lights. We parked in the farthest corner, our hearts still racing, and sat in the quiet aftermath of what had just happened. None of us spoke for a long time. Jess had her arms wrapped around herself, shivering. James was staring straight ahead, his face pale, his hands still gripping the seat, as though he couldn't quite let go. "I don't know what that was," James finally whispered, his voice hoarse. But it wasn't human. It felt wrong to even think about what we had just seen. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew. What we saw in those woods wasn't something we could explain. The man, or whatever he was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. We never spoke of it again. The next morning, we packed up and left without a word about the night before. I think we were all just too afraid to talk about it, too afraid to think about what could have happened if we hadn't left when we did. But that night, in the safety of that parking lot, I realized just how quickly things could go wrong. Just how easily a trip meant for relaxation could turn into a fight for survival. We were lucky that night. We made it out alive. But the memory of those filthy rags, those wild eyes, and that unearthly speed still haunt me. I don't think I'll ever be able to look at the woods the same way again. In the 1970s, before I was born, my dad worked as a trail guide in the mountains of Central California. He'd lead tourists on horseback along winding mountain trails, offering them a glimpse of the wild beauty of the region. He met all sorts of people during his time, but there's one encounter that stuck with him, one that he would tell me about often when I was younger, especially during those long camping trips we'd take. There was this guy, a Native American. who my dad met when he was a regular tourist on the trail. He would ride horses with the groups, but he was always quiet, keeping to himself, and seemed to have this peaceful vibe. Over time, this guy, who my dad never got to know too well, started helping out as an employee. He wasn't one of those people who shared much about his life, not even where he came from or why he had left the reservation. My dad never pressed him about it, figuring it was personal. He'd never ask someone to talk about something they weren't ready to share. The guy just came from a different place, and he kept things to himself, and that was all right. One summer day, my dad was out on the trail with his brother and the Native American guy, his friend, as my dad would call him, leading a small group of tourists. It was supposed to be a quiet, normal day of riding horses through the chaparral hills and grasslands. The tourists took pictures, the horses trotted along, and my dad and his brother joked back and forth like they always did. The guy was laughing along too, though it seemed like he was just humoring them. They were talking, but he wasn't too engaged. My dad said the guy always had a sort of far-off look in his eyes, like his mind wasn't entirely in the moment, but he never said anything to worry anyone. That day, though, something unusual happened, and it all started with a shout from one of the tourists. "Coyote!" someone yelled, pointing down into a little valley off to the left of the trail. The group stopped their horses, and everyone turned to look. Out in the distance, there was indeed a coyote, moving through the tall grass. Now, coyotes are pretty common in that area, so no one thought much of it. My dad said that they were just part of the landscape. Nobody ever thought anything of seeing them out there. But then my dad's brother, his uncle, stared a little too long at the creature. His brow furrowed, and he didn't seem to relax. "What's up?" my dad asked, noticing his brother's odd expression. "This coyote," his uncle replied. "It doesn't look right." The coyote didn't act like a normal coyote. Coyotes usually have a sort of graceful, easy way of walking, but this one didn't. Its legs looked unusually long, almost too thin. It didn't walk like a normal dog, either. Most dogs lift one leg on one side, and then the opposite leg on the other side. But this coyote's legs didn't follow that pattern. It walked in a strange, almost disjointed way, lifting both legs on one side at the same time, like a camel might move. Its snout was long, much longer than usual, and it held its nose up high, as if it were sniffing the air for something specific. My dad said it could have just been some kind of deformity, that it didn't mean anything, but his uncle wasn't convinced. "Look at it," his uncle muttered. "It's off." The Native American guy didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the coyote, and my dad noticed his friend was shivering slightly. It wasn't cold, not at all, but the guy was visibly unsettled, his gaze locked on the animal in the distance. My dad felt the unease creeping in. There was something about the way the guy was acting that made him uneasy too. "What's wrong?" my dad asked, trying to get the guy to speak up. The friend finally pointed at the coyote with a shaking finger. "The tail," he said, barely above a whisper. My dad squinted at the coyote. It was hard to see clearly from that distance, but the creature was definitely odd. He leaned forward, trying to get a better look. "What do you mean?" "It's just a coyote," my dad said, not seeing anything too strange at first. But then he looked harder, and it hit him. There was no tail. The coyote was standing there, its back end twitching slightly, but there was no tail, just a smooth, curved line. My dad's stomach tightened. "That's strange," he muttered. His friend's face had gone pale. "I don't know how, but it's not a coyote." For the rest of the ride, the group moved slowly, the tourists chatting away, but my dad's friend was silent. His eyes kept scanning the ground behind them, as if he was expecting something to jump out from the brush. The coyote followed them the whole way back, but it never came close. It just hung back at the edge of the valley, keeping a distance. When they were just a couple hundred yards from base camp, that's when it happened. Out of nowhere, the coyote leapt from the underbrush, charging straight into the path, about 20 feet ahead of the group. It startled the horses, causing them to whinny and rear up in fear. My dad and his brother instinctively grabbed for the reins, trying to calm the animals. But what got them the most wasn't the coyote's sudden appearance. It was the way it stared directly at my dad's friend, and the way it grinned. It wasn't the playful, tongue-lolling smile you'd see from a dog. This smile was something different, something unnatural. The coyote bared its yellow teeth, its gums dark and stained, showing off a grotesque grin. It looked human in a way, like it knew something that my dad and his brother didn't. They were frozen in place, staring back at it. My dad noticed his friend wasn't moving, his hand slowly reaching down into his jacket. Without taking his eyes off the creature, he pulled out a small piece of wood. It was shaped like a little token, with an arrow burned into the surface. He held it up, facing the coyote. The coyote's grin faded. It took one long look at the wooden token, and then, as if it understood something, it turned away. It didn't run, it didn't scamper off. It just turned its head and started walking slowly back into the brush, as though it had lost interest. Then it howled. But this wasn't like the typical high-pitched yip or cry you'd expect from a coyote. This howl was deep, low and drawn out, almost like it was coming from some animal with lungs full of water. It sounded sick, distorted, like it was in pain, like it was struggling to get the sound out. It sent a shiver down my dad's spine, even now when he tells the story. The coyote's howl echoed through the valley, almost like a final dying scream, before it disappeared back into the bushes. As the tension began to ease, my uncle, ever the joker, turned to the tourists with a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "Well," he said, "I hope you guys got your money's worth." At camp that evening, after they'd settled the horses and taken care of the tourists, the friend became even more withdrawn. He didn't want to talk about the coyote, not really. When my dad pressed him, all he said was, "It killed them, and now it's going to try and kill me." He wouldn't explain who had been killed or what he meant, just that this creature, the thing that wasn't a coyote, was after him. His friend didn't stay long after that. The next morning, he gathered his things in silence, handed my dad and uncle each a small piece of wood like the one he had shown the coyote, and told them, "These will protect you. They work. But it's better if you don't know too much about it. Just keep them with you. You'll be all right." At 8 o'clock that morning, he left the camp without a word, and my dad never saw him again. Over the years, my dad would tell me this story over and over, especially during those long camping trips. He'd laugh about it, like it was just another adventure, but I could hear something in his voice when he told it. Something that wasn't funny, something that never fully went away. He'd say that sometimes, on cold nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the branches creaked in the wind, he'd hear a low, eerie howl echoing through the woods. It was the same howl, the one that wasn't quite a coyote, but something else, something darker. And every time he heard it, he'd remember the thing that wasn't a coyote, and the man who had vanished without a trace. There was no ghost, no supernatural force. Just a creature, a twisted thing that had its own purpose, its own reasons for being. And whatever those reasons were, it wasn't done yet. It was the kind of night that felt like it was never going to end. The sky was black, like a void above us, the stars barely visible through the thin haze of air. El Lobo, the so-called community we were in, wasn't really much of a place. Just a few houses scattered along a back road, and that old, half-worn bridge that was way past its prime. That bridge was the kind of place where you'd stop when you didn't know what else to do. A place where it was dark enough to do whatever you wanted without anyone giving a damn. No one cared. It was just us out there. I was 20, and it felt like we had the whole night to ourselves, no rules, no worries. My friends and I were hanging out, not really doing much, just drinking and talking, standing around in the headlights of the truck. The engine was running, its soft hum the only sound except for the occasional laugh or shout from the group. We were trying to figure out who could drink the most without throwing up, some stupid contest we all agreed to pass the time. The drinks were flowing, a mix of beer and whatever else we had grabbed on a whim earlier that day. It felt like an average, no-good Saturday night. But then something changed. It happened so quickly, and for a second, I didn't even know if I was seeing things. I remember exactly how it felt when my gaze moved from the group and shifted towards the edge of the bridge. I had been trying to focus on the quiet murmur of the creek below, the little stream that always seemed to be flowing, even on the driest of days. The water shimmered faintly, the moonlight barely catching the surface. But then I saw it. It wasn't immediately obvious, just a small flicker of movement at first, like a shadow in the dark. But I wasn't thinking it was something harmless. No, my stomach dropped. I froze, completely frozen, unable to move. My eyes locked on that one spot, a small patch of greenery growing along the bank of the creek, just out of the reach of the headlights. But the thing was, it wasn't still. It was moving, growing, swelling, like something straight out of a nightmare. At first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination. But then it grew, and it grew fast, really fast. Like a vine, but not just any vine. It was shooting up at a ridiculous speed, almost like the thing was alive, like it was reaching for something, maybe me. It was this huge mass of green, curling, twisting, stretching, and all I could think was, that's it, I'm done. I was staring at it, completely unable to move, feeling my heart hammer in my chest. Sweat rolled down the sides of my face, my palms were damp, and I could barely breathe. For a moment, my thoughts ran wild. This thing was alive. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or hallucinating. Maybe I had too much to drink, I thought. Maybe the alcohol was messing with me. But it didn't feel like that. It felt too real, too solid. The plant, or whatever it was moving with purpose. The leaves were writhing in the night air, and I could swear I saw it stretch out, like it was trying to grab something. I could almost hear it, this soft, unnatural rustling sound. The image that formed in my mind was the stuff of nightmares. A sentient plant, something alien, something otherworldly. And it wasn't just in my mind. I could see it, clear as day. My hands shook, my knees felt weak, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. I was convinced it was coming for me. Or for us. For all of us. My mind raced, thinking of all the terrible things that could happen. This thing was alive, and it was growing at insane speed. It would wrap itself around us, choke the life out of us, drag us into the creek. I could almost see it happening. I thought we were all going to be the next victims of some bizarre, alien plant. The thought was so vivid, I couldn't snap myself out of it. I don't know how long I stood there, glued to that spot, terrified, completely paralyzed. My heart was pounding, louder than anything else, deafening, like it was about to burst. I could feel the adrenaline kicking in. I was ready to run, to scream, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. Everything felt wrong. My stomach turned. The plant was still growing, reaching out towards us. But something didn't feel right. It was just too unreal. And then, like a switch had flipped, my friend Mark noticed it too. I couldn't tell you how I knew he had seen it, but I could feel it. His silence. He was staring at the same thing I was, completely still, his face frozen in the same expression of shock. Mark didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I saw the fear in his eyes, the same exact terror I was feeling. It was like he had the same thought running through his head. That was when I realized I wasn't the only one having a panic attack. We both stood there, completely locked in place, each of us just waiting for something terrible to happen. I don't know how long we stood there, maybe seconds, maybe minutes. Time seemed to stretch out in this weird, slow-motion feeling, every second dragging on for what felt like eternity. The plant kept growing, and I kept thinking, this is it. This is how it ends. Then, without warning, there was a tiny flicker of light in my peripheral vision. A cigarette butt tossed over the edge of the bridge. I saw the small ember glowing briefly in the dark before it fell out of view. That's when it hit me. The movement. The growing vine. The writhing, twisting mass of green. It wasn't alive. It was smoke. The damn cigarette smoke had caught the headlights, and the way it was rising made it look like something out of a horror movie. My breath caught in my throat as everything clicked into place. The plant was smoke. That was all it was. Nothing more. I laughed, half relieved, half horrified at how my mind had twisted it into something else. It wasn't an alien creature, or a sentient vine, or whatever the hell I had been imagining. It was just smoke, rising in the headlights of the truck. A perfectly mundane, perfectly normal thing that my brain had somehow turned into a nightmare. I looked over at Mark, and I saw him doing the same thing. His face softened, and the tension in his body seemed to ease. He looked almost embarrassed, like we had both fallen for the same illusion. I had to fight back the laugh that bubbled up in my throat. The relief hit me like a flood, and I finally took in a deep breath, letting go of the tight knot in my chest. We stood there for a moment, just staring at the spot where the smoke had been. There was no plant. There was no alien vine trying to kill us. It was just nothing. Just the quiet night, the sound of the creek, and the faint hum of the truck engine. We were fine. I don't know how I felt about it in that moment. I didn't feel stupid, not exactly. But I felt like I had just crossed over into some weird part of my brain where fear had taken over, and reason had been completely out of the picture. It was terrifying how real it had all felt. How the fear had gripped me and made me see things that weren't even there. Looking back, I still don't know what triggered it. Maybe it was the isolation of being out in the middle of nowhere, the heavy drink and the dark, the quiet. Maybe it was the way the headlights caught the smoke and twisted it into something monstrous. Whatever it was, I'll never forget that feeling. The one where you think you're about to die. That raw, unfiltered fear that makes your mind go to places it shouldn't. Mark and I never talked about it much after that night. I don't think we ever really had to. We knew what happened. It was one of those things that, when you look back on it, you just laugh at, but in that moment, it was real. It felt like I was standing on the edge of some terrible, irreversible event, something that would make the news. But in the end, it was just smoke. And maybe that's the scariest part, how easily our minds can twist the world into something else, something much worse. A few months after I moved into my house, I was getting more comfortable with the space. It was an old place, the kind that had character in every creak of the floorboards and the dust that settled in the corners. The walls were a bit thin, and sometimes, when the wind was right, I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the highway. The backyard was spacious with overgrown trees and bushes, and a couple of times, I caught sight of deer grazing near the edge of the forest behind the house. Overall, it was quiet, which was exactly what I needed after the chaotic move. It was a long weekend, and I decided to stay home and get some things done. I hadn't had much time to really settle in yet, still unpacking boxes here and there. But today, I planned to take it easy. I needed to clean, cook, and maybe even start planning out some changes I wanted to make in the house. I'd been putting it off for a while, but it felt like the perfect opportunity to knock a few things off the to-do list. I had the oven going, roasting some chicken, and started chopping vegetables for a side dish. The smell of garlic, rosemary, and chicken filled the kitchen, making my stomach growl. It was a calm, peaceful moment, and I felt content just being at home, not worrying about work or anything else. While the chicken was in the oven, I figured I'd take a quick shower. It wasn't too often that I had the house to myself like this, and I didn't want to waste the opportunity. I grabbed a towel from the bathroom and headed to the shower. The water was warm, and the steam quickly fogged up the bathroom mirror. I stood there for a while, letting the hot water run down my back, trying to relax. It was one of those simple pleasures, something that always seemed to make everything else fade away. When I finished, I wrapped myself in a towel, stepping out of the bathroom, and heard it. The beep. The incessant beep of my oven timer, letting me know that the food was done. I couldn't help but smile a little to myself, typical. I was getting so caught up in my own thoughts that I almost forgot about the chicken entirely. I quickly walked into the kitchen, my bare feet making soft slapping noises against the cold tile floor. The food smelled amazing, golden brown and crisp at the edges. I took the chicken out of the oven, careful not to burn myself, and set it down on the countertop. The sides would take a little longer, but that was fine. I wasn't in a rush. I moved around the kitchen, adding spices and putting things in pots, still thinking about the list of things I needed to do around the house. As I finished up, I remembered I still had to clean up in the bathroom. I had left the towel on the floor, and there were a couple of stray items I had to put away. I wasn't exactly great at keeping everything perfectly neat, but I tried. I walked back down the hallway, my feet sinking into the plush carpet as I entered the bathroom and quickly began tidying up. It was a simple task, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I stepped back into the kitchen, something was wrong. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The kitchen was still lit, warm from the oven, but the odd thing I noticed was a small, almost indistinct spot on the floor. It was just off to the side of the tile near the island. I bent down, squinting. My heart immediately skipped a beat. Blood. A small splatter of blood, right there on the floor. It was a faint, bright red mark, just one drop, but it was there. And it wasn't mine. I froze, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. My brain raced, jumping to conclusions faster than I could think. Had someone broken in? Was there an intruder hiding in my house? My heart started pounding in my chest as panic flooded in. What if they were still here? What if they were waiting for me, hiding somewhere, ready to hurt me? I instinctively backed up, my skin prickling, the towel wrapped tightly around me, now feeling useless. My mind spun with terrifying thoughts, none of them making sense, but all of them too real in my head. Someone had to have broken in. There was no other explanation. I thought of the broken window in the living room, the one I'd noticed during the move-in inspection, though I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Could it have been the glass? Maybe someone had gotten hurt trying to get in and was now hiding somewhere, waiting to pounce when I least expected it. I turned around quickly, making my way to the front door, ready to bolt out of the house. My hand was trembling as I grabbed my phone, calling my then boyfriend. I didn't know what to say, but I had to tell someone. He answered on the third ring. "Hello. I think someone's in the house," I said, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. "There's blood in the kitchen. I don't know how it got there, but I think someone's in here." He immediately told me to stay calm, but of course he couldn't come. He was at work, a good hour away. The fear that gripped me made me dizzy, my thoughts a blur. I couldn't stay here alone. I needed help. I called my neighbor next. She was an older woman, someone I'd barely spoken to, but she was the only other person close by. I explained the situation, trying to stay calm while I felt anything but. She agreed to come over right away, offering the kind of reassuring tone that only someone who'd lived in the area for decades could give. Minutes later, she was at my door. She was wearing a cozy cardigan and carrying a large tote bag, looking like she was prepared for anything. I led her to the kitchen, still too nervous to say much, pointing out the blood on the floor. She squatted down, inspecting it closely, but said nothing for a moment. I watched her face carefully, trying to gauge what she thought. "I don't think this is from someone else," she said after a beat. "But we'll take a look around. Better safe than sorry." We armed ourselves with knives, just in case, and slowly crept through the house. We checked every room, the closets, and all the hallways. We even opened up the basement door, which I dreaded, but there was nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fresh blood, no strange noises. Just the usual stillness of an old house. But still, the blood on the floor didn't make sense. My neighbor left after a while, reassuring me again that everything seemed fine. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and embarrassment. My mind was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something. But there was no one here. No one hiding. No intruder. Just me, my thoughts, and the strange drop of blood. I decided to clean up. I grabbed a rag and some disinfectant, carefully wiping up the blood, still wondering how the hell it got there. It had to be a mistake, right? But the longer I stared at the spot on the floor, the more it felt like I was missing something important. I couldn't let it go. I kept retracing my steps, trying to think of every moment, every motion I'd made since stepping out of the shower. Later that day, when I went to the bathroom again, it hit me. I had started my period. I felt a wave of embarrassment rush through me, cheeks burning. How had I missed that? How had I not realized it when I'd gone into the kitchen? The answer was so simple, but it felt like the weight of the whole situation had only just dropped into place. When I squatted down to take the chicken out of the oven, a drop of blood must have fallen from me onto the floor. It was so small, so insignificant, that it hadn't even registered until I saw it on the tile. I stood there in the bathroom, staring at the mirror, trying to shake off the mix of embarrassment and relief. I had let my imagination get the best of me. I thought I had a serious problem, an intruder, a break-in, a hidden danger. But it was just me. I couldn't help but laugh a little at myself, shaking my head. How ridiculous it had all seemed in the moment. My thoughts had spiraled out of control. I was alone in an old house, and I'd let my fears take over. In the end, it wasn't anything sinister at all. I spent the rest of the evening finishing my cooking and settling into the house again, this time more at ease, but also aware of how easily fear could distort the simple realities of my life. I used to be terrified of sleeping when I was a kid. I don't even know how it started or why, but I remember it all the same. The nightmares, the night terrors, the feeling of something being in the room, even when there was nothing there. It got so bad that I'd never sleep more than 4 hours at a time. If I did, it was because I was utterly exhausted from not sleeping the previous nights. The fatigue was overwhelming, and it fed into this growing sense of paranoia that I had. I don't know how to explain it, except that I was constantly on edge, always looking over my shoulder, even in my own house. I think the lack of sleep messed with my mind. It started as just little things, a movement out of the corner of my eye that I'd try to convince myself was just a shadow. But there was always a part of me deep down that couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight. I'd turn around, and of course, there was never anything there. But still, every time it happened, my heart would race. I'd try to dismiss it, telling myself it was nothing, that I was just tired. But then one night, something happened that I couldn't explain away. It was late, maybe around 2 a.m., and I was walking down the hallway in the dark. I don't even know what I was doing out of bed at that hour, but I remember feeling that familiar sense of dread as I passed by the kitchen and into the hallway that led to my bedroom. The air felt heavy, thick with the quiet of the house. The only sound was the faint hum of the fridge in the next room. It was then that I saw it, a tall, wispy figure, something smoky, standing at the far end of the hallway. My stomach dropped. I thought maybe it was just another trick my mind was playing on me. So, I turned my head slightly, willing myself to not look too closely. But then I froze. The figure wasn't gone. It was still there. And its eyes, they were yellow. Not just any yellow, but a piercing, glowing yellow that seemed far too bright for the low light in the house. It was the only thing that looked solid, almost like a reflection, as though it didn't quite belong. I could feel the dread building up in my chest, the tightness creeping over me as I realized it wasn't going to disappear like everything else usually did. I couldn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at it. But eventually, it seemed to fade, like smoke evaporating into the dark. My legs felt like they'd been turned to stone, and I just stood there, unable to process what I had just seen. I couldn't convince myself that it wasn't real. I knew what I'd seen. The dread stayed with me for days. And then something strange happened. One evening, when I was older, my dad told me something that made my skin crawl. He said that when I was little, the church had told him that something with yellow eyes had been tormenting me. He said it as though it was something they knew about, but it wasn't something he had shared with me before. It wasn't until that moment that I made the connection. I never told him about what I'd seen in the hallway that night. No one had, but somehow they knew. I didn't know what to think, so I pushed it to the back of my mind. I was older now, and I had other things to worry about. The nightmares didn't stop, though. They didn't go away for a long time. But eventually, I grew up, and they faded from my memory. Life got busier. I had new things to focus on, like high school and hanging out with friends. The world became less about shadows in the corner and more about the normal problems that come with growing up. I almost forgot about the thing in the hallway, the thing with the yellow eyes, until recently. A few months ago, I took my little sister to a midnight showing of a horror movie. We'd been talking about weird and creepy things we had experienced in the past. It was one of those late night, let's share spooky stories kind of conversations. Mostly we laughed it off, trying to rationalize everything. I told her about the nightmares and the shadowy things I used to see. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. When she was younger, she told me she used to see shadow people out of the corner of her eye. At first, I thought she was just messing with me, playing off the idea that we had both been through weird experiences. But then, she told me about one day when she was home alone. She had stayed home sick from school, watching TV in the living room. Everything was normal, at least at first. But then, she heard something from the hallway. She told me that she turned, expecting to see nothing, like always. But this time, there it was. The same tall, wispy silhouette. The same glowing yellow eyes. I froze, unable to speak. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even want to know. I was sitting there, thinking back to the countless nights I had spent looking over my shoulder, wondering if it would come back. But hearing her say it, hearing her describe it in such detail, it made everything feel real again. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying her words. My body felt like it was on high alert, but I couldn't get comfortable. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the image of that thing from my mind. But it wouldn't go away. I didn't want to tell her how much it had freaked me out, but it made me remember how awful things used to be, how the shadows seemed to always be watching, waiting. I thought I had left that behind, but hearing her recount it, hearing her describe it the way I remembered it, it was as if the past had come crashing back. The house felt heavier, darker, even with the lights on. And then one night, just after we'd had that conversation, it happened again. I was sitting in the living room, my sister was upstairs, and everything was quiet. I thought I heard something at first, a faint rustling from the hallway. I ignored it, but then I heard it again, more distinct this time. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. I slowly walked toward the hallway, the same hallway where I had seen the figure years ago. The shadows stretched long and dark, but everything seemed still. I looked up, and for a split second, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, something tall, smoky, just at the edge of the light. I blinked, trying to make it go away. But when I opened my eyes again, it was there. The same silhouette, the same yellow eyes, staring right at me. I took a step back, panic setting in. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My mind was racing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But there it was, standing in the hallway like it had never left. Then, just like before, it began to fade. Slowly, like smoke dissipating in the night air. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place. I watched as it vanished, my heart still hammering in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I was terrified, not of the figure itself, but of the realization that somehow, it wasn't just a trick of the mind. Somehow it was real. Somehow this thing, whatever it was, had followed us. And it wasn't just me. The next day, I didn't tell my sister about what had happened. I couldn't bring myself to. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, whatever had tormented me as a kid, was still here, still watching. I don't know what it was. I don't know if I'll ever understand. But I do know one thing for sure. It's still out there. And maybe, just maybe, it's not done with us yet. Our old house was situated at the corner of a quiet street, the kind of place where you could almost hear every sound of nature if you listened hard enough. It was on the edge of a small neighborhood, with a main road running just a few yards from our front yard. The house was old, built sometime in the 70s, and looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in decades. The walls were a faded, almost grayish blue, and the yard was overgrown with wild grass that we could never quite tame. The driveway was cracked, with weeds pushing through every gap. From the outside, it looked like a house that had been forgotten by the world. Inside, it wasn't any better. We didn't have much, certainly not enough to make the place feel like a home you'd see in magazines, but we got by. It was just me, my mom, and my younger brother. My mom worked long hours at a local diner, and my brother and I kept to ourselves for the most part. We didn't have fancy things, but we had each other, and that was enough. Even though it wasn't the safest neighborhood, we managed. There was a strange comfort in the quiet, the way everything seemed still, as if the house itself was part of the landscape. But that silence didn't last. One night, I woke up to the sound of my mom yelling. At first, I didn't really register what was happening. I was on the futon in the living room, lying on my side, half dreaming. The darkness of the room was thick and heavy, and the cold night air crept through the thin walls. The sound of my mom's voice hit me like a sudden burst of static. I sat up, blinking into the dark, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Get out!" My mom's voice was frantic now. "Get out of my house!" I froze. My mind was still foggy with sleep, and I couldn't understand what was going on. Then I saw him. A figure, moving quickly in the shadows. A man dressed entirely in black, with a hoodie pulled low over his head. I barely had time to process it before he was gone, darting past me like a shadow, moving so fast that I hardly had time to register the panic on his face. It was like something out of a nightmare, but it was real. I could hear my mom shouting something else, but I couldn't quite make it out. The figure was already at the door, running out into the night. I heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway, then the screech of tires as he sped off in a car I didn't see. I was more surprised to be woken up that early rather than the fact that a burglar had just broken into our house. My heart was still racing, and I felt disoriented, trying to piece together what had just happened. But the truth of it hit me fast, and I wasn't sure if I should be scared or just angry. The guy hadn't taken anything. I don't think he even had a chance to really get into the house. He had probably heard my mom shout, realized he'd been noticed, and bolted. I didn't feel relieved, though. I felt vulnerable. Like this could happen again, at any moment. This wasn't the first time the house had been broken into, and it wouldn't be the last. In fact, I'd gotten used to the idea. We weren't exactly living in a safe area, and I knew that people would take advantage of our situation. We weren't rich, not by any stretch. We were lower middle class, scraping by and trying to make it through each month. Our house wasn't anything special, but it was home to us. To anyone else, though, it was just another target. This time, however, it felt different. It wasn't the first break-in. That honor belonged to a few months earlier, when we came home from a grocery run to find the back door kicked in, the place ransacked. They had taken a few of our older electronics, a couple of my mom's small appliances, and even the last of the canned food we had. But this time, the way that guy had looked, moving so fast, like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he'd done it 100 times before, left me shaken. Later, my mom told me that she had woken up to find him in the hallway, just a few feet from her bedroom. She'd gotten up, hoping to catch him before he got away, but he was faster. By the time she yelled, he was already gone. "Did you see his face?" I asked her when she came back into the room, still panting from the adrenaline. She shook her head, her eyes wide, still trying to calm down. "No," she said. He was wearing a hoodie, kept his head down. I don't even know if he knew I was awake until I yelled. But I know he wasn't here to just steal stuff. That wasn't the only time something like that had happened, though. We got used to it, to the strange feeling of being on edge. In that neighborhood, there were people who thought nothing of breaking into houses if they thought they could get away with it. The police weren't quick to respond, and the community wasn't much better. Everyone kept to themselves. It wasn't until the third break-in, when the cops finally got involved, that we realized how bad things had really gotten. But even then, it was always too late. The police showed up after the damage was done, and by then, whoever had done it was long gone. Still, the house itself never felt safe after that. The walls seemed thinner, the doors less sturdy. Every sound I heard in the night, every creak of the floorboards, sent my heart racing. I could never quite shake the feeling that someone was always watching, waiting for the right moment. But nothing was ever certain. I didn't know if it was the burglars or just my imagination, but the fear was real. I knew it, and my mom knew it. And every time we heard a noise outside, we would both tense up, waiting for something to happen. But then there were the nights when it wasn't the burglars or the shadows that kept me up. There were nights when something else happened. Something that terrified me in a different way. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move. I'd be lying on my side, my face pressed against the pillow, but I couldn't seem to open my eyes fully. I could only move my eyeballs, glancing around the room, trying to make sense of what was going on. The air was heavy, suffocating, like it was pressing down on my chest. And then, there was the feeling behind me. I couldn't explain it. It was like something was there, right behind me, so close I could almost feel it breathing on my neck. But I couldn't move. My body felt like it was frozen in place, every muscle locked, unable to act. And I could feel it. The purest form of fear, the kind that wraps around your soul and doesn't let go. I knew, instinctively, that if I turned my head just slightly to see what was behind me, it would be bad. I don't know how I knew, but I did. My body screamed at me not to look, to keep my eyes forward, to not let whatever it was behind me know I was awake. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed, feeling the weight of the fear pressing down harder with each passing second. I could feel my heart racing, my breath shallow, my eyes darting around the room, hoping for anything that might break the hold it had on me. But it was like being trapped in my own body. It lasted for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. And then, like some invisible force had released me, I was able to move again. I jumped up from the futon, my body drenched in sweat, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. It wasn't just the feeling of something being there. It was the certainty of it. That cold, heavy feeling that someone, or something, was just waiting, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. Waiting for me to look. I never told anyone about those nights. I couldn't. I wasn't sure if I was just losing my mind, or if there was something else going on. But I couldn't shake it. It felt like a presence, like the house itself was somehow different after the break-ins. Like it wasn't just the people outside that were dangerous. It was something in the walls, in the air, that made everything feel wrong. But as time went on, I got used to it. Maybe not the fear, but the feeling that it was all just part of the house, part of the danger. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock on the door, every rustle in the bushes outside, it all became part of the rhythm of living there. A rhythm I couldn't escape, no matter how much I tried. We moved out of that house when I turned 16. The rent had gone up, and my mom finally found a job that allowed us to afford something better. But that house, that old, creaky house, stayed with me long after we left. Every now and then, when I drive by the old street, I can still feel the weight of it. The way the house had seemed to settle into the land, like it was part of it. I don't know what it was that made it feel so wrong, but I'll never forget the way it felt to be inside it, with the quiet, the shadows, and the fear that never quite left. Even now, I wonder if I was just imagining things. But I don't think I was. I don't think I was imagining it at all. I didn't think I had anything really creepy to post about until I started reading through other people's experiences. There was one that was oddly similar to something I went through, and suddenly, all those memories came flooding back. I hadn't really thought much about it in years, but now looking back, it feels so unsettling and manipulative that I can't believe I didn't realize what was happening at the time. It started around my sophomore year in high school. At first, it seemed innocent enough, just prank calls. I'd get a random phone call late at night, and I'd answer it to hear some muffled laughter or someone hanging up. Sometimes it was a strange voice, but it wasn't really anything I thought much of. Back then, prank calls were still a thing. Everyone was doing it, and nobody really thought about the consequences. So, I'd laugh it off and forget about it until the next time it happened. It was always random, and the calls came at strange hours. I remember feeling a bit confused about it, but again, nothing to freak out about. It felt like just some dumb joke that would eventually stop. But then, they started happening more often, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. It got to the point where I'd just expect it. The same strange voices, the same silence after I'd pick up the phone. It was like whoever was doing it had all the time in the world to just mess with me. At the time, I thought it was probably just some friends trying to get a reaction. I never considered it was anything more serious than that. Still, as time went on, it got a little weirder. These calls weren't like the funny, harmless pranks I was used to. They started to feel like someone was trying to make me anxious, to put me on edge. At the time, I was just focused on school, so it wasn't something I dwelled on too long. By the time I got into my junior year, things escalated. It wasn't just random calls anymore. They were more targeted. They started calling my house phone along with my cell. Now, my house number wasn't something I gave out to anyone except family, so it was odd that they had both numbers. It was getting harder to brush it off, but I still didn't think too much of it. Everyone in high school was obsessed with cell phones by then, and I guess I figured my number had somehow gotten out. It was easy to blame it on some random person I didn't know. Then came the messages. Texts started coming in, and they were even stranger. Some of them were just disturbing, like someone knew things about me that I hadn't shared with anyone. It wasn't just about me, though. They started texting my boyfriend at the time, sending him nasty, untrue things about me. I remember one text in particular. It said something like, "She's with some guy right now, and you wouldn't believe what she's doing." They even knew where I was. It was always in the middle of some random situation, and they seemed to always have the timing right. Sometimes they'd text me things like, "You don't want your boyfriend to find out, do you?" It was confusing and terrifying. The first few times it happened, I just thought it was some misunderstanding, or that maybe someone had just gone too far with the prank. But the texts kept coming, and soon enough, they started to impact my relationship. I started to question my boyfriend more, wondering if he was getting these texts, and whether or not I could trust him. We'd fight about it, and things got tense between us. But like everything else, the messages and calls would stop just as suddenly as they had started. They'd go quiet for a while, and I'd forget about it until it all happened again. By the time I was in college, I thought I'd left all that behind me. I deleted my old MySpace account, cleared my Facebook friends list, and really tried to start fresh. It was a new chapter for me, and I wanted to leave all the old baggage behind. I was still dating the same guy, but I distanced myself from everyone else. I figured if I just moved on, the past would stay in the past. I didn't even think about those calls or messages anymore. But then, halfway through my freshman year, they started again. It wasn't as bad at first. The calls and texts came in, but I thought maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe it was someone who had somehow found me online. I had a new phone, new friends, a whole new life. I had no idea how they were getting my information, but they knew. The messages started coming through on my phone again, but this time, they were way worse. They were more personal. They were talking about things no one could have known unless they'd been following me for years. I began to feel the same anxiety I had in high school, only now it was worse. It felt like there was no escape. Then came the threats. They started saying things like, "I have pictures of you," or "I can't wait to show everyone who you really are." I tried ignoring it at first, thinking it would stop like it always did, but it didn't. They started saying that they had nude photos of me and were going to Photoshop them and send them out to people I knew. The idea of that happening, of losing control over something so personal, sent me into a panic. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I blocked one number, but the next day, a new number would send the same kinds of texts. I started feeling paranoid, like I couldn't trust anyone. I didn't want to tell anyone about what was going on because I felt embarrassed. How could I explain this without sounding like I was overreacting? I didn't even know who to blame. I was isolated. I stopped talking to my old friends. I stopped answering texts, and I felt myself slipping deeper into a depression. Everything around me started to feel off. like I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next message or call. One night, I went to a concert with my boyfriend. He'd gotten drunk, and we had a huge fight. I didn't think it would lead to anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got home to my parents' house that night around midnight, I felt exhausted. But then around 2 a.m., it started. The phone calls came in again, only this time they were different. These weren't just the usual creepy messages. This time, there were men calling, asking for my sexual services. The calls kept coming, one after the other, different numbers every time. We tried blocking them, but the numbers just kept changing. My mom got up and tried to figure out what was going on, but I felt so violated. I didn't know who would do something like that, let alone why. We ended up just unplugging the phone, but that didn't make me feel any safer. The next day, we filed a police report and changed our landline number. When the police investigated, they found something I hadn't expected. Someone had posted my number on Craigslist, listing me as a prostitute. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that someone had gone this far to ruin my life. I had no idea how they got my number, but it all seemed so deliberate. It took a while to put everything together, but eventually, I realized the one constant in all of this was my boyfriend. He had been around during all of these incidents. The drunk fight we had the night before the Craigslist post didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. I began to wonder if he had something to do with all of it. The more I thought about it, the more everything started to make sense, even though I didn't have solid proof. He had been controlling, isolating me from my friends, and manipulating me into thinking he was the only person I could trust. I finally had to leave him, even though it took multiple tries before I was able to do it. I moved on, started dating someone else, and eventually found a wonderful guy who became my husband. I told him about what had happened, but by then, I was emotionally distant enough from it all that it didn't affect me as much as it once had. I thought the past was behind me, but then last year, it started again. I had a new phone, new number, new everything. I had blocked anyone associated with my ex, and I trusted the people around me not to hand out my number. But somehow, it started happening again. The texts came in, always when I was with my husband. They were meant to cause problems, insinuating that I had been cheating on him. My husband and I knew something wasn't right, so we decided to make another police report and list my ex as a suspect. This time, I was serious. I was ready to take legal action. The detective tried to contact my ex, but he was never able to reach him. After that, the calls and texts stopped. I couldn't believe it. It was over. I was lucky that this time, I had someone who believed me, who helped me get through it. I still don't have proof that it was him, but the fact that the harassment stopped once the police got involved tells me everything I need to know. When I think back on everything now, it's hard to fully understand just how manipulative and messed up my ex was. I never really thought about how he might have been stalking me, or how it all seemed like part of some plan. I was so young, and I trusted him in ways I never should have. Now, I'm just grateful it's behind me. I've moved on, and I'm finally at peace with it all. But I'll never forget the fear, the anxiety, and the confusion. I was harassed for years, and in the end, the person I trusted the most was the one who hurt me the most. I had been living in my first apartment alone for just about 2 weeks when everything started to feel wrong. The apartment was in a rundown building that had seen better days, but it was affordable, which is exactly why I ended up there. I wasn't expecting luxury. It was a basement apartment, which meant cheap rent and a sense of being tucked away from the world. The windows were right at ground level, and the view was just enough to see legs and shoes walk by on the sidewalk. In a way, it felt private, and I liked that. I could sit by the window and gaze out without worrying too much about anyone looking in, or so I thought. The apartment had 2 bedrooms. I slept in one, keeping the blinds closed at night. The other room, however, was the one I hadn't yet bothered to furnish. It was empty except for some boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. There was also noticeable water damage on the wall under the window, and because of that, I kept the blinds in that room fully up during the day, hoping that letting in sunlight would help it dry out before the maintenance crew got around to fixing it. Everything was normal for the first few days. I'd work, I'd come home, eat some frozen food, watch a few shows, and go to sleep. But one night, everything changed. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest, and my mind instantly alert. It wasn't like I'd been dreaming or gradually waking up from a peaceful sleep. It felt more like someone had just flipped a switch in my brain, and I was wide awake, fully aware of everything around me. I stared at the ceiling for a moment, trying to understand why I felt so uneasy. The air felt thick with tension, and I could feel every single nerve in my body on edge. I reached over to check my phone. It was 4:02 a.m. I tried to settle back down, convincing myself that it was just one of those nights when you wake up and can't fall back asleep. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out of place, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I turned my head slightly to look at the window. The blinds were closed, and everything seemed calm. But then I froze. A large, dark shadow appeared against the blinds. It wasn't just a shape. This was a clear figure, standing outside my window, casting a dark silhouette in the dim moonlight. The shadow held a flashlight, and I could see the beam moving slowly across the ground, scanning back and forth. The beam shifted up towards the window, and for a split second, I thought the person might look directly in. My breath caught in my throat. I could see nothing but the figure, tall, with a broad build, wearing what looked like heavy boots. They had keys hanging from their belt that jingled every time they moved. I stayed as still as possible, terrified to make a sound. I knew I couldn't just lie there and hope it would go away. I had to figure out what was going on. My mind raced, and a surge of panic hit me like a freight train. Was someone trying to break into my apartment? Or worse, was this some kind of stalker? I quietly pulled the covers off and moved slowly toward the other bedroom. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I reached the doorway, trying to make as little noise as possible, and peered around the corner. I could see the person standing near the window of the other room. They were scanning the floor of my bedroom with the flashlight, moving methodically back and forth. My minspun. This wasn't just someone passing by. This was someone intentionally looking into my apartment. My immediate thought was that this was it. I was alone, in a basement apartment, with a complete stranger outside my window, and I had no way of knowing their intentions. I quickly grabbed a small hunting knife that I kept by my bed. Useless, I knew, against a grown man with malicious intent, but it was all I had. My adrenaline was sky high, and my hands shook as I clutched the knife. I couldn't let this person break in. I had to protect myself. As I stood there, trying to keep my breathing quiet and my heart from beating out of my chest, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I flinched, startled by the sudden noise, but quickly grabbed it. It was a message from a friend of mine who worked in the police force. "What's going on at your apartment?" it read. I stared at the message, confused. Was she checking on me? Did she know something I didn't? I typed back quickly, my fingers shaking. "I think someone's outside my window." I waited for what felt like an eternity, staring at the person outside, who was still scanning my bedroom with the flashlight. My grip on the knife tightened. This was really happening. Just as I was about to respond with more details, the figure outside the window slowly began to move away, walking towards the side of the building. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding, but my body was still tense, waiting for the next move. Not a minute passed before my phone buzzed again. It was a response from my friend. "Stay calm, I'll check on it." Before I could even think about how to react, there was a loud, forceful knock on my front door. It startled me so badly that I nearly dropped the knife. My heart skipped a beat. Who could that be at this hour? I didn't move for a moment, too scared to even breathe. Then, I heard the knock again, louder this time. Whoever it was wasn't going to stop. Panic gripped me. I didn't have a peephole, and the only lock on my door was a deadbolt. I quickly pulled on a pair of slippers, trying to steady my breath. I had to know who it was before I opened the door. I stood as silently as I could, holding my breath, hoping I would hear a voice or some kind of clue that would help me decide whether I should open the door or not. Then, I heard a soft voice from the other side. "It's the police." My heart sank. I didn't trust it for a second. I had just been staring at someone trying to break into my apartment, and now the police were here, knocking at my door in the middle of the night. It felt like a setup. My mind raced as I thought of all the worst-case scenarios. Was this some kind of trap? I was terrified. If it was really the police, they would understand if I didn't open the door right away. Wouldn't they? I stood there silently, weighing my options, then the voice came again, more urgently. "You're not in trouble. Please just open the door." I wasn't sure what to think. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I finally decided to crack open the door, just a sliver, in case I needed to slam it shut at any moment. I peeked through the gap and saw two uniformed police officers standing there. One was at the bottom of the stairs, and the other was closer, at the top. I could see their expressions. One officer seemed genuinely apologetic, the other looked a little embarrassed. They must have seen the knife in my hand, still clenched tightly in my fingers, because one of them quickly stepped back. "Sorry, ma'am," the officer closest to me said. "We're the ones who were looking in your windows." I stared at him, stunned, trying to process what was happening. What did he mean? They were the ones. The same police officers who had scared me half to death? "We thought someone had broken in," the other officer added. "There was a mix-up with an apartment. Someone got drunk, lost their keys, and accidentally broke into the wrong apartment. We thought it was yours." I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. "So, you were looking in my window?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes, ma'am. We apologize. It was a misunderstanding. We were trying to figure out where the break-in occurred, and when we saw your window wide open, we assumed it was yours." The adrenaline rush finally broke, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I didn't even realize I'd been holding back the tears until that moment. I had been ready to fight someone off, but instead, it was the police, and they had been trying to help, just not in the way I expected. I couldn't even form the words to tell them how scared I had been. I just nodded and closed the door, leaning against it, my hands still shaking. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or scream. My mind was still trying to catch up with what had just happened. The next day, I got the full story from my friend who had been texting me. The drunk resident had thought he was going into his own apartment, and when he couldn't get in, he started wandering around outside, trying to find another way in. The police had mistakenly thought it was my apartment he was trying to break into. In the end, I laughed about it. I was scared out of my mind, but at least no one had actually been trying to hurt me. It was just a dumb mistake. But it didn't make that night any less terrifying. Now, when I look back, I realize that fear is an odd thing. It makes you do things you never thought you would. And in the end, all I wanted was to feel safe in my own home. But I did feel safe again, eventually. My friend checked in on me more often after that, and I kept the blinds down for good measure. It was an experience I wouldn't forget anytime soon. I never thought I'd be scared by the very people I was supposed to trust to protect me, but in a weird way, I was just glad it was all over. And of course, I never left my windows wide open again. My cousin and his family had been living in their home for about 5 years by the time this happened. They'd bought the house shortly after their wedding, settling in right when their son was born. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone waved hello as they passed by, and no one locked their doors unless they were heading out of town. My cousin Tim worked as a contractor and often left early for work, while his wife, Sarah, stayed home with their infant son, Noah. They had a routine, and it was easy to feel comfortable in their little world. But that morning, everything changed. Sarah had left the house earlier that day, like every other morning, to drop Noah off at daycare. It was a typical chilly fall morning, the sun still hiding behind a thin layer of clouds. After she got back to the house, she realized she had left her phone on the kitchen counter. It wasn't uncommon for her to forget it, but it was still frustrating, and she needed to grab it before she left for work. Tim had already left hours ago, and Noah was with the sitter, so she thought it would be quick. She parked in the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, and went inside. The house was quiet, the way it always was when Tim wasn't there. She stepped into the entryway, and as she moved down the hall, she suddenly froze. The attic ladder was down, fully extended. Sarah stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The ladder, which was usually stowed neatly away, had been pulled down and was now hanging in the middle of the hallway, blocking her path. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood there, trying to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe Tim had gotten something out of the attic and hadn't bothered to put the ladder away. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized it didn't make sense. Tim had left for work hours ago. He would never have left the ladder down. The attic wasn't used for anything, really, just some old boxes of seasonal decorations and old furniture they hadn't gotten around to donating. She took a cautious step forward, then another. Her heart began to pound. She thought she heard something, maybe a creak, but it was hard to tell. Everything felt off. Sarah wasn't the type to scare easily, but there was something about that ladder, the way it hung there, as though someone had left it down intentionally, that made her uneasy. After a long pause, she slowly backed away, her eyes never leaving the attic ladder. There was no way she was going to go up there. She knew something was wrong, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Without thinking, she turned and walked out of the house, her pulse racing in her ears. The cool morning air hit her like a slap in the face, but it didn't calm her down. She quickly got into her car and drove around the block, trying to clear her head. But she couldn't. Her gut was telling her something was wrong. The ladder hadn't been the only thing that had fell off. There was something about the silence in the house, too. It was too quiet, like the house had been holding its breath. She couldn't wait any longer. She called the police. The officers arrived within minutes, but by the time they'd started their investigation, Sarah was already starting to regret her decision. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But when the officers began their search of the house, they started to find things that didn't make sense either. They checked the attic first. The ladder was still down, just as Sarah had left it. But when they climbed up into the attic, they found something unexpected. It wasn't just boxes and old furniture up there. There was something else. A small, hidden compartment had been built into the wall, and inside, they found a device, one that looked like a short-range transmitter. It was connected to several cameras hidden throughout the house. One above the shower light, another inside the ceiling fan above their bed, and one more discreetly placed in the nursery, right next to Noah's crib. The officers were quiet as they examined the setup. They found wiring running through the walls, the ceiling, and the floorboards. It wasn't just one camera. There were several. The house had been turned into a little surveillance station. It wasn't long before they traced the signal from the transmitter to a nearby location. The officers quickly left to investigate, and Sarah, feeling more than a little dizzy at this point, was left standing in the entryway. She wanted to be sick, to scream, but she couldn't. She just stood there, numb. The police came back an hour later, their faces grim. They had found the source of the signals. It was the house of their neighbor, a man named Greg. He lived a few houses down and had been given a key to the house by the previous owners. At first, no one had thought much of it. It was a friendly gesture, after all. But when the police knocked on Greg's door, he didn't answer. They didn't have to wait long. They found his car parked in the driveway, and through the window, they could see him sitting at his desk, staring at the computer screen. When the officers knocked again, this time more forcefully, he opened the door. Greg didn't say anything at first. He just looked at them with a kind of blank expression, like he had no idea what they were talking about. But when they showed him the transmitter, he immediately broke down. Greg had been spying on Tim and Sarah for years. He'd known their schedule, their routines, their every move. He'd watched them from his house, through hidden cameras, as if their lives were nothing more than a game to him. He'd been doing it for so long that he'd even gone as far as to install new cameras and update his equipment when needed, right under their noses. The attic ladder, the one Sarah had found, had been left down the day she walked in on him. He'd been caught off guard, leaving just as she walked into the house. Sarah felt a cold sweat drip down her back as the truth sank in. This man, their neighbor, had been watching them for years, knowing everything about their lives and feeling no remorse for it. And the worst part, he had been watching Noah, their baby boy, as well. The police arrested Greg, and when they searched his house, they found more equipment, more hidden cameras, more devices. It was clear he had been obsessed. The authorities questioned him, but he showed no signs of remorse. He simply seemed baffled that anyone would care about what he'd done. To him, it was just harmless curiosity. But to Sarah and Tim, it was a violation, a complete destruction of their sense of safety and privacy. It took time for them to recover. The trust that had once been a solid foundation of their marriage was shaken. Tim was angry, but he also felt a deep sense of guilt that he hadn't noticed anything sooner. And Sarah, she couldn't shake the image of the attic ladder. The thought that someone had been so close, so deep inside their lives, left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. They moved shortly after the investigation, finding a new home where they could start fresh. But the memories of that day never really left them. Every once in a while, Sarah would find herself glancing up at the attic in their new house, just to make sure the ladder wasn't hanging down, waiting for her to walk into it. Even years later, she'd catch herself looking over her shoulder when she stepped outside, as if she could still feel the weight of someone's gaze on her. What happened to Greg? The police never found any motive. He was charged with invasion of privacy, stalking, and several other crimes, but the damage was done. To this day, Sarah can't forget how it felt to walk into her own home and realize that someone had been watching them all along. They had thought they were safe in their own house, but sometimes safety is something you can never take for granted. It was a normal weekend, or at least it was supposed to be. My parents had gone out of town for a few days, leaving me home alone. At first, it felt pretty liberating. I was a teenager, so being on my own in the house felt like a small taste of freedom. I stayed up later than usual, watching TV in my parents' room because it had the biggest screen and a comfy bed. I wasn't much of a night person, but I just started watching a new show that had me hooked, and I figured I'd watch a few more episodes before heading to bed. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes you start to notice things. Creaks in the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint rustling of the wind against the windows. But it was peaceful, and that was what I liked about being alone. There was something calming about the house in the dark, even though it always felt a little bigger when I was by myself. I don't remember exactly when I first felt it, but around 2 a.m., I started getting that strange feeling, the one you get when you're being watched. My skin crawled, and my heart picked up speed. It wasn't a noise or anything that triggered it, just this deep sense of unease. It wasn't the kind of feeling you get when you're just paranoid. It was heavier, like someone was there, but you couldn't hear them. I glanced up, my eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement, but I didn't see anything. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was home alone, after all. It wasn't like there was anyone else here. But that feeling wouldn't go away. It lingered, sitting like a weight on my chest, pressing me to look in the direction of the hallway. The dim light from the TV screen was the only thing that lit up the house, casting shadows against the walls. And then, as I shifted my gaze, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes adjusting, that maybe I was imagining things. But then it became clearer. It wasn't a trick of the light, not just a shadow from the furniture or anything like that. It was something else. A figure. A pure black mass in the shape of a man, standing just outside the hallway, perfectly still. I could see it there, framed in the darkness of the hallway, barely visible except for the faint outline that was almost a negative silhouette against the darker black of the hallway. I froze, my eyes locked on it. I had no idea what it was, but I knew one thing. There was something standing there, something I couldn't explain. It didn't move at first, but I could feel it. I was terrified, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath became shallow, and I found it hard to swallow. I just stared back at it. It was as if time had stopped, and all I could do was look at the shadow. My brain was telling me to get up, to run, to do anything, but my body didn't obey. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. In that time, 100 thoughts raced through my mind. Was it real? Was it a burglar? Maybe I was just imagining it, but everything about it felt too solid. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no clothes, just the shape. The outline was distinct enough to see that it was man-shaped, but there were no features, no texture, nothing. It felt like it was made from the darkness itself, like it was the absence of light, taking on the shape of a person. Then, without warning, it moved. Slowly, almost casually, it turned its head and started walking down the hall. I couldn't move. My eyes followed it, my body rigid as I sat frozen on the bed. It wasn't quick, but it wasn't slow either. It seemed deliberate, almost confident. As it walked away, the heavy, terrifying presence seemed to fade, but only slightly. It still lingered in the back of my mind. I didn't breathe again until it was completely out of view, and even then, I still felt the weight of it, like I was being hunted by something unseen. A few seconds later, I heard it, a loud crash that echoed through the house. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I was too scared to move, too terrified to even go check what it was. My hands were clammy, my heart thudding in my ears. I immediately grabbed the remote and turned the TV to the Disney Channel. It was bright and cheerful, but the mindless cartoons were the only thing that could ease my nerves. I tried to focus on them, tried to make myself believe that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, the TV running in the background, trying to block out the fear that was still gnawing at me. I didn't sleep at all that night. My eyes kept flicking to the hallway, expecting to see the shape again, but nothing came. I finally drifted off into an exhausted sleep, but even then, I wasn't fully at ease. My dreams were filled with shadows, with strange shapes moving in the dark. Every time I woke up in the night, I would glance toward the hallway, half expecting to see that figure still standing there waiting. When I woke up in the morning, the light from the rising sun was already creeping through the windows. I felt a little better, but still uneasy. I figured that whatever had happened last night was just a figment of my imagination, or maybe a weird half-dream. I got up, trying to push the memory of the shadow out of my mind. I needed to go to the bathroom, so I walked down the hall, still a little groggy from the restless night. That's when I noticed it. At the end of the hall, just outside the bathroom, there was a mirror on the floor. It wasn't there the night before, and it wasn't supposed to be. It had been hanging on the wall, near the bathroom door, but now it was shattered into pieces, the glass scattered across the floor. The frame was cracked, hanging lopsided as if it had been ripped from the wall. I stood there, staring at it, my stomach sinking. I don't know how it fell. I don't know if it had been the figure from last night, or if something else had caused it. I didn't hear any more crashes after I'd heard that first one, so it wasn't like it had fallen while I was awake. But the way the glass was shattered and scattered, the way it seemed so deliberate, sent a chill down my spine. It felt like everything that happened last night was real. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know if I should tell anyone. I went back to the room, my mind racing. I wasn't sure what I had seen the night before. It didn't feel like a nightmare, but then, what could it have been? I couldn't explain it. I still can't. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely, something that didn't fit anywhere in my understanding of the world. And it wasn't something I could tell my family about. They wouldn't believe me. They never did. The weird part is, after that morning, things went back to normal, or at least as normal as they could. I didn't tell my parents about the broken mirror because I knew they'd just think I was imagining things. And they never mentioned it either. It was like it never happened, like no one had noticed anything strange. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I can't forget it. I still don't have an explanation for what happened that night. But the one thing I'm sure of is that I wasn't alone in the house. Whether it was a person, a shadow, or something else, I'll never know. But I'll never forget the way it looked at me, the way it moved, and the way it made me feel. I don't stay home alone anymore, not after that night. And every time I walk down that hallway, I can't help but glance at the spot where the mirror had been, wondering if the shadow will return. When I was 4 years old, my father, my stepmother, and my baby brother died in a car accident on Highway 84, somewhere between Lubbock and Abilene, in West Texas. It's strange to even say it like that, like it's just a fact that's part of my life, because for a long time, it barely felt real to me. I didn't remember any of them. My parents had split up before I was old enough to form solid memories, and after the divorce, my father's visits had been spaced out and sporadic. I don't remember his voice, the way he looked at me, what it felt like when he picked me up. I didn't even remember the baby brother they had together, or my stepmother's laugh, or her touch. All I knew about them was what people told me in bits and pieces growing up. The accident happened on a long, empty stretch of Highway 84. If you've ever driven that road, you know it feels like it goes on forever. Flat plains, a few lonely houses, some brittle trees leaning against the wind, nothing but the road and the big, open sky. They had been driving from Albuquerque to Houston to pick me up for a few months of visitation. They never made it. They stopped on the shoulder to check on my baby brother, who was crying and having a fit in the back seat. They never saw the semi-truck coming. The truck driver had been on the road too long, pushing through his exhaustion to make his delivery. Maybe he thought he could go just a little bit further. Maybe he didn't even realize how tired he was. He veered off the road, hit their car full force at around 70 miles per hour, going downhill. There was no time to move, no time to react. It was all over in seconds. The car caught fire after the collision. No one inside made it out. Only the truck driver survived. Growing up, people treated the story like something fragile, like I was too young to hear it properly, or too delicate to carry the weight of it. I would overhear bits and pieces, whispered conversations, words caught in the middle of a sentence when I walked into the room. As I got older, the story filled itself in. But it stayed distant, like hearing about something that happened to someone else, a shadow hovering on the edge of my life that I never dared to look at directly. By the time I was in college, I had learned how to live with it. It wasn't something I talked about much. It wasn't something I even thought about very often. It was just a fact about me, like the color of my eyes or the place I was born. a silent absence. I ended up attending Texas Tech in Lubbock. It wasn't intentional, not some sentimental choice. It was affordable. It had my program. It made sense. But it meant that a few times a year, whenever I made the drive back and forth between Lubbock and DFW, I would pass right by the place where it happened. I didn't know exactly where the accident had been. I just knew it was somewhere along that endless stretch. And every time I drove that road, there was a point, somewhere past Sweetwater but before Post, where a strange heaviness would settle over me. I would grip the steering wheel a little tighter. My chest would feel tighter. It was like something in the air shifted, but there were no signs, no markers, no way to know if I was passing the exact spot, or if it was still miles ahead or already behind me. It wasn't until my third year at Tech that I decided to really look into it. I don't even know what made me do it. Maybe it was a late night spent scrolling the internet. Maybe it was the quiet nagging of a curiosity I had been ignoring for too long. I typed what little I knew into the search bar. Highway 84, Lubbock, Abilene, car accident, late 90s semi-truck. It took a while, but I found something. There was an old article, not from a big newspaper, but from a smaller local outlet. A report of the accident. A young family traveling from New Mexico to Texas. Stopped on the side of the road. Hit by a truck. No survivors in the car. It was surreal, reading about my own family like that, reduced to a paragraph. No names, just facts. But there was something else, too. A forum post. Some discussion board buried deep in the internet. Someone claiming they had seen the crash. They lived in a small house near the highway, not far from the scene. They had called for help after seeing the smoke and flames. And they wrote something strange, that in the years afterward, they and others had sometimes seen a family walking along the side of the highway. A man, a woman, a small child. Walking and walking, always moving but never getting closer to anywhere. They wrote about how they could see them out their window sometimes, just figures along the shoulder, almost like a mirage. And every time, by the time they looked twice, they would be gone. Not ghosts, exactly, just memories caught on the side of the road. I didn't know how to process that. I sat at my desk for a long time just staring at the screen. My heart felt like it was breaking open in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't even know them. I didn't even remember them. But reading that, knowing that they had been so close to picking me up, so close to seeing me, and then gone, it hit me in a way nothing else ever had. It was like feeling the weight of everything I had missed all at once. The hugs I never got, the birthdays they missed, the years and years of growing up without them. I cried that night. Not just a few tears, but the deep, wrenching kind of crying that leaves you feeling hollow and exhausted. I didn't even know who exactly I was mourning. People who were technically family, but strangers in my mind. It was like mourning a life that never had the chance to be. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I made that drive, I paid more attention. I looked at the mile markers, the landmarks, trying to guess where it might have happened. I thought about stopping, about pulling over, and just being there for a minute. But I never did. Not at first. It was a conversation with an older gas station clerk in one of the small towns along the way that finally pushed me to act. I asked casually if he remembered an accident around there from the late 90s involving a semi and a family on the side of the highway. His face changed immediately. He nodded, said it was one of the worst things that had ever happened around there. He pointed roughly to where it had been, a certain stretch a few miles down, near an old, bent fence and a cluster of dying mesquite trees. The next trip, I planned for it. I left early, giving myself time. As I got closer to the area he had described, I slowed down. There wasn't much to see, just the same wide, open land, the same thin strip of asphalt cutting through the emptiness. But when I found the spot, or at least what I thought was the spot, something in me knew. I pulled over onto the shoulder, putting my hazard lights on. I sat there for a long time. I didn't get out right away. I just sat in the car with the engine off, listening to the wind pushing against the windows. In the distance, I could see a small, crumbling house, the roof sagging in the middle, the paint long gone. Maybe that was where the person who had called for help had lived. Maybe not. It didn't matter. Eventually, I got out. The wind was stronger than I expected. It pushed against me as I walked a few steps away from the car. The ground was hard-packed dirt and gravel. A few scrubby weeds struggled up through the cracks. There was no memorial, no flowers, no sign that anything had ever happened there. Just empty land and endless sky. I stood there for a while, feeling small, feeling like a thread stretched back through time, tugging at something I couldn't quite reach. I closed my eyes and tried to picture them, my father, my stepmother, my baby brother. I tried to picture them as real people, not just shadows. I pictured them laughing in the car, talking about the drive, thinking about seeing me soon. I pictured my baby brother fussing in the back seat, my stepmother turning to check on him, my father putting the car in park. Ordinary moments. Tiny moments that no one would have remembered if not for what happened next. I stayed until the sun started to dip lower in the sky, turning everything gold. I didn't say anything out loud. It didn't feel right, but I thought it as hard as I could. I'm here. I remember you. I'm sorry. I hope you're at peace. Then I got back in the car and kept driving. I still pass by that spot sometimes. Every once in a while, when the light hits just right, when the wind shifts a certain way, I feel it again, that weight, that pull. It's not scary. It's not even really sad, not the way it used to be. It's just part of me now, stitched into who I am. I don't look for them. I don't expect to see anything on the side of the highway. But sometimes, when I glance out the window, I imagine them there, not stuck, not lost, but just walking together, a family on a journey, moving forward. And I keep moving too, carrying them with me, in a way that's quieter and heavier and more real than I can explain. When I think back on it now, I don't think of the accident as just a tragedy anymore. I think of the love that made them drive all that way to come get me. The care that made them pull over when the baby needed something. The hope they had for the future, even if they never got to reach it. It's a reminder every time I get behind the wheel, every time I make that drive. Life is fragile. People are fragile. Time slips through your fingers before you even know you're holding it. So now, I make sure to tell the people I love how much they mean to me every chance I get. I slow down when I need to. I pull over if I'm tired. I don't rush through moments thinking there will always be another chance, because sometimes there isn't, and all you have left are the memories you make, and the quiet spaces where you can still feel them if you listen hard enough. It was the summer I turned 7 when my parents decided to send me to live with my grandmother. They had to move to another city for a couple of months for work while waiting for my older brother to finish middle school. I was ecstatic. I didn't fully understand the reasons behind it at the time, but to me, it sounded like the greatest adventure. Grandma's house was big, always full of people, and I knew I'd be spoiled. My parents were busy with their work, and I knew they'd be coming to visit me soon enough, but for now, I was off to Grandma's. Grandma lived in a 2-bedroom house, but the place was never quiet. Her 4 children, my aunts and uncle, still lived there. The house was older, the kind that creaked when you walked through it, and the floorboards were warped in places. The air always smelled faintly of old wood and something earthy, like the house had been standing for ages, collecting the scent of time itself. Grandma had a knack for making it feel warm despite the chill that always seemed to hang in the corners of the rooms. At first, I loved it. I loved the way Grandma would spoil me with sweet treats and extra helpings of whatever food she cooked. I was the youngest, and everything felt more fun when I was there. My cousins were around, and there were so many people that it felt like a big, happy family reunion every day. But there was one thing I couldn't quite figure out. 3 of my aunts and I shared the same bedroom. It wasn't huge, but it had enough space for the 4 of us to cram into with our beds pushed together. My grandma and uncle slept in the living room on a couple of mattresses that were always laid out at night. And then there was my aunt, the one who had a room all to herself. She was schizophrenic. I didn't understand what that meant back then, but I knew she was different from the others. Her name was Aunt Mary, and she spent a lot of time in her room, alone. Grandma never really talked about her illness, but everyone knew. Aunt Mary had been like this for years. She would talk to herself for hours. Sometimes, she would just sit in her room and mumble in a low voice, her words half-formed, sometimes angry, sometimes sad. I didn't know what she was talking about, but it always sounded off, like a conversation no one was meant to hear. I remember her room clearly, small, with old furniture and crayons scattered everywhere. It was like she would get these bursts of energy and start drawing all over the walls, leaving marks and random scribbles behind. Some days, the whole room would be covered in crayon drawings, shapes and colors that didn't make sense. Grandma didn't seem to mind. She would just let Aunt Mary do whatever she wanted, even though the room looked like a mess. For a while, I thought it was all just part of Grandma's way of dealing with things. She wasn't very strict, and sometimes, when Aunt Mary would start talking to herself, Grandma would just sit with her, listening patiently, as if everything was normal. To me, as a kid, it felt like the strangest place in the world, but at the same time, it was oddly comforting. My grandma's house, with all its quirks and eccentricities, was still home to me. But as time went on, I began to feel more and more uneasy about my aunt. At first, I thought she was just weird, and maybe I wasn't supposed to understand. But then, things started to get stranger. I didn't realize at first, but Aunt Mary had a new habit. She started cutting hair. It wasn't anything that happened every day, but every once in a while, I would notice one of my aunts or cousins coming out of her room with their hair a little shorter than it had been before. At first, it was just the odd stray strand, but soon it started happening more often. Aunt Mary would come out of her room and smile, her fingers stained with hair dye or bits of cut-off locks. She didn't seem to care about it. If anything, it made her happy. But it made the rest of us uncomfortable. She would sit there, quietly, scissors in hand, and stare at whoever was closest, as if waiting for them to fall asleep or be distracted. I started to notice the way she would look at me too. Her eyes had this far-off expression, like she wasn't really seeing anything in front of her. She would often come into the room where my cousins and I slept and just stand in the doorway, watching us. It was eerie, like she was trying to figure something out or waiting for an opportunity. I never said anything, but I always felt her presence lingering in the shadows of the room. It was one of those nights that changed everything. I woke up in the middle of the night, my body stiff and cold, my blanket tangled around me. I could hear something soft and rhythmic, the sound of breathing. For a moment, I thought it was just my aunt or cousins in their sleep, but as I blinked and tried to adjust to the darkness, I realized something was off. The breathing wasn't normal, it was uneven, almost labored, and it was coming from beside me. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and in the dim moonlight that filtered through the window, I saw her. Aunt Mary was standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide open, staring at me. She was holding something in her hand, something small and metallic. I couldn't make it out at first, but then I saw the scissors. She was holding the scissors, her fingers gripping them tightly, and she was staring down at me with a strange expression. I could see her lips moving, but I couldn't hear anything. Her face was pale in the moonlight, and her breathing was erratic. She was so still, I thought for a moment that I had imagined it, that maybe I was still half asleep. But then she took a step closer, and I could see the scissors glint in the low light. I froze. For a second, I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. It felt like a dream, but I knew it wasn't. She had that look in her eyes, the kind of look that made your stomach turn. I didn't know if she was fully aware of what she was doing, but I could feel the danger. I could feel the chill of the scissors too close to my neck. My breath caught in my throat as she leaned in, still staring at me. I was paralyzed, my body unwilling to move, unwilling to speak. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. Everything inside me told me to run, but I couldn't. She was too close. Her presence filled the room like a dark cloud, and I couldn't escape it. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, Aunt Mary backed away. It was like something snapped her out of it. She turned slowly and left the room without saying a word. The scissors were still in her hand, but she was moving like a sleepwalker, unaware of what had just happened. I lay there in bed, my heart racing, my mind in a daze. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, exhausted from the shock. The next morning, I pretended nothing had happened. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even know what to say. It was too strange, too frightening to even put into words. But that night, when my parents showed up to pick me up, I didn't argue. I didn't resist. I was ready to leave. I knew it wasn't a place for me anymore, and I couldn't stay another minute. When my parents picked me up, they could tell something had happened, something I wasn't talking about. They didn't push me, though. I think they knew I'd tell them when I was ready. And that was the last time I ever stayed with my grandma. We moved to an old house in the city. It was even older than Grandma's, and it felt like it was falling apart. The worst part, earthworms started coming up from the drains at night. At first, it was just a few squirming their way out of the shower drain, but it didn't stop there. Every night, more and more of them appeared. The air smelled musty, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. It wasn't much better than the nightmare I had left behind. Still, I was safer. I was far from Aunt Mary's scissors and the strange world she lived in. I was standing at the train station, the usual feeling of impatience settling in as I glanced at the digital clock on the platform. It was almost midnight, and the station was quiet. The streetlights flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the platform. I could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, but everything else seemed to be muffled by the cold, empty air. The stillness felt strange, almost eerie, as though the entire world had slipped into some kind of surreal silence. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, rubbing my hands together to warm them, looking down at my phone to pass the time. The train wasn't scheduled to arrive for another 15 minutes, so I stood there, half watching the clock, half lost in thought. The platform wasn't completely empty. There were a few people scattered here and there, some of them sitting on the benches, others pacing around, but there was a sense of emptiness that only comes with being at a late-hour station. My train was supposed to be the last of the night, and it always felt strange, as though it was the last link to the outside world before everything went dark. As I waited, I noticed a figure approaching from the far end of the platform. At first, I didn't pay much attention, just a person walking toward me. But then something about the way he moved caught my attention. He was tall, unusually tall. As he got closer, I could make out the details of his appearance. He was carrying a large suitcase, his arms struggling to keep hold of it. The suitcase was odd, though. It didn't look like the usual luggage you'd see at a station. It was bulky, almost misshapen, and seemed far heavier than it should have been. I watched as he came closer, the suitcase swaying with every step. But what made my stomach turn was that the suitcase wasn't just heavy, it was leaking something thick and dark. At first, I thought it might have been water, but the liquid was too dark and viscous. It glistened in the dim light of the station, pooling slightly around the base of the suitcase with each step he took. The man didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. I stood frozen, my heart beginning to race. There was something off about him. The way he walked was unsteady, like he was drunk, or maybe even high. His gait was jerky, and his grip on the suitcase seemed to be slipping more with each step, as if the weight was too much for him. His clothes were torn in several places, dirt smeared across his face and hands, and there were cuts on his forearms. As he got closer, the sharp smell of something foul hit me, and I instinctively stepped back a few feet. I tried not to look at the suitcase too closely, but my mind wouldn't stop racing with thoughts of what could be inside. When he was only a few feet away, he suddenly stopped in front of me. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto mine. His face was pale, almost sickly looking, and his lips parted as he muttered something under his breath. His voice was low, rough, like he was struggling to form words. There was an aggression in his tone that sent a chill down my spine. "Take the bag," he ordered. His voice was slurred, and the words came out in a strange jumble, but it was clear enough. I stood there, staring at him, not sure how to respond. My mouth went dry, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I glanced quickly at the suitcase, the thick liquid pooling on the ground, and then back at him. My instincts told me to get away, but I didn't know what to do. I couldn't take the bag, but I didn't want to anger him either. "Sorry," I managed to say, my voice shaky. I took a small step backward, still unsure whether to walk away or try to talk to him. But then, something about the way he looked at me, the look in his eyes, made me want to keep my distance even more. I turned, deciding to step away slowly. My mind was racing, and I tried not to look back at the man as I made my way toward the end of the platform, closer to where the train would be pulling in. I could feel his gaze on my back as I walked, but I didn't dare to look over my shoulder. Just as I reached the platform's edge, I heard the sound of his footsteps behind me. I quickened my pace, trying to get away from him. But no matter how fast I walked, I could hear him getting closer. The sound of his heavy boots echoed against the concrete. He was following me. I kept my eyes trained ahead, focusing on the approaching train's lights in the distance. I hoped it would arrive soon, but the closer it got, the more I felt a creeping sense of panic in my chest. The tall man was still behind me, his footsteps getting louder. I could hear him mumbling to himself, the words slurring and indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. He was agitated, frustrated. My pulse quickened. I could feel the weight of his presence, like a dark cloud hanging just behind me. I glanced back over my shoulder for a brief moment. He was still there, standing just a few feet behind me. His eyes locked onto mine again, and his mouth moved, but no words came out. He was grinning, a strange, unsettling grin that sent a shiver down my spine. The train was getting closer, the sound of its wheels on the track growing louder. I quickened my pace, my steps echoing against the platform. The tall man kept following me, his own steps matching mine in an eerie rhythm. I could see the train now, the lights gleaming in the distance. The platform was starting to fill with other passengers, and I felt a momentary sense of relief. At least I wasn't alone. But then the man spoke again, his voice a garbled mess of words that I couldn't make out. He was still coming toward me, still closing the distance. I reached the edge of the platform just as the train pulled in, the doors opening with a hiss. Without thinking, I stepped inside, the door closing behind me almost instantly. I pressed myself against the window, watching as the tall man stood outside, just a few feet away. He was still pointing at me, his face twisted in anger. He continued to shout, though the words were nothing more than garbled noise. His hands pounded against the glass, a dull thud that sent a jolt of panic through me. His eyes were wide with something, frustration, rage, maybe even desperation. He was yelling now, his face pressed against the glass, eyes locked onto mine. I felt a sense of relief wash over me as the train slowly began to move, pulling away from the platform. But just as the distance between us grew, I saw him slam his fist against the window. The impact sent a sharp noise through the train, and I flinched, my heart racing. His face was still pressed to the glass, and even though the train was moving, his gaze never left mine. The train's motion started to carry me away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked around at the other passengers, but none of them seemed to notice or care. They were all engrossed in their phones, reading newspapers, or staring off into space. I was the only one who seemed to be caught in the moment of pure, unfiltered fear. The man's image was still burned into my mind. His angry face, the suitcase leaking that dark liquid, the unsettling look in his eyes. It felt like a nightmare, but it was real. Too real. I tried to steady my breathing, but the lingering sense of unease didn't fade. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have been in that suitcase. The cuts on his arms, the dirt on his face, the strange way he moved, it didn't add up. I knew I had barely escaped a potentially dangerous situation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The train continued to pull away, and the tall man grew smaller in the distance. Eventually, he disappeared from view entirely, but the memory of him lingered. The feeling of dread and fear that had taken root in me wouldn't go away. It wasn't until I reached my stop and stepped off the train that I finally felt a sense of release, though the unease still clung to me like a second skin. It was a relief to finally be free of the strange man and the odd encounter, but I knew I'd never forget the terror I felt that night. The tall man, the suitcase, the dark liquid, it all felt like a warning, something I couldn't quite understand but couldn't ignore. We lived in a house in Thailand that I can still remember clearly, even though it was years ago. I was about 10 years old at the time, and my younger sister and I shared a room. The house had this weird vibe to it, something that just felt off, but back then I couldn't put my finger on it. Looking back now, I realized there were things I should have noticed sooner. Our room was upstairs, separated from the rest of the house by a small Jack and Jill bathroom. On the other side of that bathroom was another room, an empty one that my parents said we weren't allowed to go into. I don't know why, they never explained. They'd say things like, "Don't go in there, it's just storage." But I could tell there was something about it they didn't want us to know. It was always locked, and the smell of dust and stale air would hit you when you passed by. But what really got to us was what happened when we were downstairs, or even when we were in our room at night. We had a maid who would come and clean the house. I didn't like her much. She was always yelling at me and my sister for the smallest things. Turn off the ceiling fan. Don't leave the lights on. She would get upset if we didn't do exactly what she wanted, even though we were just kids. The ceiling fan thing was the worst. She'd scream at us for it, even though we didn't see the big deal. We were just trying to sleep and stay cool. But she'd always make a huge fuss over it, telling us that it wasn't good to leave it on all night. Still, we didn't mind it too much. We had bigger things to worry about. There were noises that didn't make sense. I don't know if anyone else in the house ever heard them, but my sister and I sure did. At night, when we were in bed, we would hear what sounded like kids running around in that room behind the bathroom, the one that we weren't allowed to enter. Sometimes it was the sound of bouncing balls, sometimes the sound of laughing, just the kind of sounds you'd expect from kids playing. But it was strange. It wasn't just the kind of thing you'd hear in the distance, like a neighbor's kids. No, this was right next to us, as if they were in that room, right behind the wall. It used to drive me crazy because no matter what time it was, we'd hear it. And it was always coming from that room. I'd tell my sister, "Did you hear that?" And she'd nod, eyes wide, not needing to say a word. It was like we both knew something was off, but neither of us wanted to admit it. We never dared go into that room, even though we were curious. We just stayed in our own room, waiting for the sounds to stop. And they didn't. One night, my sister and I invited a friend over for a sleepover. We were excited, staying up late, giggling and talking. We decided to set up blanket tents in that empty room, the one with the locked door. We pulled our sleeping bags into the room, stacked the blankets on the floor, and made a little fort. It seemed harmless enough at the time, but I should have known better. The room had this thick air in it, like it hadn't been touched in a long time. It was cold, but we didn't think much of it. We turned off the lights, the only light coming from the moon through the window. The walls seemed so close around us, and we were having fun just chatting about silly things, but then we heard it, scratching. It was faint at first, like something, or someone, was running their nails against the wall. My heart stopped. I looked at my sister, and she was staring wide-eyed at the same wall. We didn't say anything. We just froze. The scratching went on for a few more seconds, and then it stopped. But the silence that followed was just as eerie. We didn't know what to do. We stayed still, holding our breaths, not even daring to make a sound. And then, without warning, the armoire in the corner of the room, an old, heavy wooden wardrobe, suddenly creaked. The doors opened by themselves. Slowly, at first, then with a sharp screech that echoed through the room. I didn't know if I could breathe or scream. My friend was already standing, looking terrified. My sister and I both bolted out of that room so fast I didn't even stop to grab my shoes. We ran down the stairs and outside into the yard, the cool night air hitting me in the face, but it didn't feel like it helped. We stood in the yard for a while, not knowing what to do. We never went back in that room again after that night. The next morning, I was hoping it was just a bad dream, but the fear I felt was still there. My sister and I didn't talk much about it, but I could tell she was just as scared as I was. We decided to ask the maid about it, trying to get her to explain why she kept yelling at us about the ceiling fan, and if she knew anything about the noises we heard. Her reaction was strange. She didn't even look at us when we asked her. She just muttered something under her breath in Thai, and told us it wasn't good to be messing around in that room. She didn't explain why, though. She just told us to stay out of it. Later on, we found out that the land behind our house led to a swamp. It wasn't something you'd notice unless you were looking for it. The locals told us that it wasn't just any swamp, that it had a dark history. They said that people used to dump their babies there. I didn't understand it at the time, but as I grew older, I started to piece things together. That swamp was right behind our house, not far from the backyard fence. It was an old, overgrown part of the land that nobody went near. I wondered if that was why the house felt so strange, if it was the place where people had done terrible things. Maybe the noises in the room weren't from anything as simple as kids playing. Maybe there was something deeper, something wrong, something left behind. The more I thought about it, the more it all started to make sense. The sounds we heard at night, the strange atmosphere in the room, the locked door. It wasn't just the house, it was the land. The people who lived there before us. What had they experienced? What had they left behind? It took a long time before I was ready to leave that house. My parents eventually moved us to a new place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that followed me for years. The memories of that house stayed with me long after we left. I never told my parents about what we heard or saw that night. They probably wouldn't have believed us anyway. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right with that house. Something dark and unsettling had been there long before we arrived, and it left its mark on me. Years later, when I was old enough to understand more, I asked the locals about the swamp again. They told me that the stories were true. Babies, unwanted, were left to die there. And the more I learned, the more I realized that those sounds we heard, the feeling in that room, it was all connected. It was something old, something tragic that had been tied to the land for generations. And we had lived right in the middle of it, oblivious. Maybe it was just the swamp. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But I don't think so. I think that house, that land, was cursed in a way. Not with ghosts or spirits, but with something much darker. Something tied to the land itself. Something that never truly left. I used to live in an old house in Toronto with 2 roommates. It wasn't much, but it worked for us at the time. The house was pretty standard, a 2-story with a basement, but it felt a little strange in some ways. We lived on the main floor, while a guy we barely knew stayed in the basement. All I really knew about him was that he was a big gamer and smoked a lot of weed. I never interacted with him much, aside from the occasional "hey" when I bumped into him in the hallway. But there was one thing about him that started to get under my skin: his coughing. At night, when it was quiet, I'd often hear this horrible, deep, hacking cough coming from below. It wasn't just an occasional cough, it sounded like the guy was dying. It started as a soft wheeze, building up into a series of desperate, gasping coughs. It wasn't just annoying, it was unsettling. I'd hear it through the ceiling, faintly at first, but over time it seemed like it was getting louder, more persistent. It sounded like he was choking on something, or worse, like he was struggling to breathe at all. Sometimes it went on for minutes, sometimes longer. It got to the point where I wasn't even sure if he was okay, but I never asked. I didn't want to get involved with him, not beyond the basics. The coughing seemed to come from below my room, but as time passed, I started to notice something odd. It wasn't coming directly from the space underneath me, but from a part of the basement farther out, closer to where the garage was. The sound echoed up through the floorboards. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. It was like there was something going on in that specific part of the basement, a part one had never really seen or paid attention to before. One evening, my roommate and I decided to investigate. We were curious, and honestly, it felt like something wasn't right. We went into the garage, which was attached to the house, and jumped up and down in the corner. The sound of our footsteps thudded hollow beneath us, as if there was a large, empty space below. We stopped and listened. The coughing came through the floor again, louder than ever, as if it was happening directly under us. It made my skin crawl. I had no idea what was in that part of the basement, but I started to get a bad feeling about it. A few weeks later, the guy in the basement moved out. It was an odd situation. He didn't say goodbye, didn't even let us know he was leaving. He just packed up his things and vanished. I didn't care that he was gone. In fact, I felt relieved. We could now move our friend into the basement, who had been looking for a place to stay. It seemed like a good deal for everyone. We were all familiar with each other, and our friend was trustworthy. The day our friend moved in was the first time any of us went down into the basement to see the space for ourselves. I'd never really been down there before. Aside from a few quick trips to grab something from the laundry room, I'd kept my distance. But this time, I wanted to see the part of the basement that had been causing so much noise. I was curious, but also a little apprehensive. We went into the laundry room first, which was right below my room, and that's when we saw it, the red door. It was small, tucked away in a corner, almost like it didn't belong. It looked like an old, heavy door, the kind you'd find in an abandoned building or a forgotten cellar. There was something off about it, something that made me hesitate for a second before pushing it open. My friend, already annoyed with the state of the basement, walked ahead of us, clearly uninterested in the weird room we were about to explore. When the door creaked open, we stepped into a small, cement room. The air was thick, musty, and damp, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The walls were stained with mold, the floors covered in old furniture, broken boxes, and piles of trash. It was like a forgotten storage room, with no real purpose. There was no light down there, only the faint glow of a single bulb hanging overhead, flickering every few seconds. The whole place felt suffocating, like it was slowly closing in on you. I glanced around, taking in the dirt and decay. This was where the guy had spent his time, smoking weed every day. It seemed unbelievable. There was no ventilation, no windows. The smell of mold and stale air was overwhelming, and I couldn't help but feel like it was dangerous to be down there for too long. I turned to my friend, who was clearly irritated by the whole situation. He didn't understand why we were so fascinated by this weird room. I couldn't blame him. He had just moved in, and his focus was on settling into the apartment, not exploring the creepy basement. He was already cursing the state of the place, annoyed that the former tenant had left it in such a mess. He didn't seem to care about the strange room at all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about it. My gut was telling me that this was more than just a neglected space. Then, my friend mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He casually said that the guy who had lived there before had been gone for 2 weeks already. I froze. 2 weeks. That didn't add up. I had only seen the guy leave a few days ago. He had moved out so quickly that I didn't think to ask any questions, but hearing my friend say that it had been 2 weeks made everything click. The coughing, the horrible, drawn-out coughing that I had been hearing almost every night for who knows how long. It hadn't been him. It had been someone else. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. All this time, I had been hearing that hacking cough, the kind that sounded like someone was fighting for air, and it wasn't even the guy who had lived there. It was someone or something else. The realization hit me hard, and I felt the urge to get out of that basement as quickly as possible. I didn't know what to make of it, but it didn't feel right. We stood there in the dingy room for a moment, unsure of what to do next. My friend still didn't seem to care much. He was focused on getting his things in order and getting the hell out of that basement. But I couldn't stop thinking about the coughing, the eerie sound that had been haunting me for weeks. It wasn't just paranoia. It was something I had heard with my own ears. It was a noise that didn't belong in that house, something that shouldn't have been there. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mind kept drifting back to the basement and the strange, neglected room under the garage. I kept hearing the coughing, echoing in my mind. It was like it was still happening, like I could hear it right beneath me. I tried to brush it off as just a figment of my imagination, but the unease kept growing. Something wasn't right in that house. Something had been there long before we moved in, and it wasn't just the guy who had lived in the basement. I never did figure out what had happened in that house. We never spoke about the coughing again, but every time I walked past the laundry room, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. I started to avoid the basement, and eventually I moved out of that house, not long after. I couldn't get over the feeling that something had been living in that space, and it wasn't the guy who had moved out. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't help but wonder if there was something darker hidden away in that creepy basement. Something that had been there long before we ever arrived. The coughing stopped after I moved out, but I'll never forget the strange, unsettling feeling that place left me with. I don't know what it was, but I'll always remember the sound of that cough echoing up from the basement, long after the guy was gone. It was a regular Thursday evening, and I was on my usual walk to my psychiatrist's office. I was about 12 or 13 years old, and at that age, I was more or less used to the routine of my life. The walk itself wasn't bad. It was a peaceful 30-minute journey that I enjoyed, especially after dark when the streets seemed to quiet down. There was something calming about the stillness of the night, the cool air brushing against my face, and the way the world seemed to move at a slower pace. I wasn't bothered by the darkness. I didn't feel threatened or scared. My neighborhood was quiet, nothing too sketchy about it. My route didn't take me through any dangerous parts of town. It was, in fact, one of the few times I could feel some sense of solitude. That evening, the streetlights flickered overhead as I walked along the sidewalk. I stuck to the side streets, which were always a little less traveled at night. I wasn't the most outgoing kid, and I liked having time to myself. The sound of my shoes tapping against the pavement was the only noise breaking the quiet around me. As I walked, I let my mind wander. I wasn't in a hurry, so I just enjoyed the walk, passing the usual houses, the occasional dog barking behind fences, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was about halfway into my walk when I first saw the car. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary at first. A Cadillac, just a regular, run-of-the-mill car, cruising down the street. But then, the people in the car started leaning out of the windows. I could see their faces clearly. They were in their late teens or early 20s, just a group of young people having fun, probably not thinking twice about who they were bothering. The first thing they did was start shouting at me, taunting me. It was the usual kind of stuff, but it felt strange. I'd been walking down this street for years, and I didn't recognize any of them. It wasn't just a casual comment. They were really trying to get under my skin. They jeered at me, making fun of the way I looked, the way I was walking, just throwing insults out the window as they passed by. At first, I tried to ignore them. I kept my head down, my hands shoved in my jacket pockets, and my pace steady. But I could still hear them behind me, even after the car had passed. It was getting to me, though, in a way I didn't like. I just wanted to get to my appointment, and they were making something so simple feel so difficult. I told myself it was just some dumb kids trying to mess with me, nothing to worry about. Then, a couple of minutes passed, and I noticed something unsettling. The same Cadillac came back down the street. This time, they didn't even try to hide their intentions. The people in the car hung out the windows again, shouting louder, making it obvious that they were deliberately focusing on me. I could feel my heart rate pick up a little, but I tried to stay calm. I kept walking. I didn't look at them. I didn't even want to acknowledge them anymore. Maybe they were just messing with me, but it was starting to feel like more than that. A few minutes after that, the same car came around again. I could feel their eyes on me, even before they started taunting me. The insults, the laughter, it was all directed at me. They were circling the block now, deliberately coming back for another round. I started to feel a pit in my stomach. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. Why were they doing this? Why me? It wasn't like I knew anyone in that car. I had never seen them before in my life. At that moment, I had a sick feeling in my gut, and I knew something wasn't right. I didn't want to risk being anywhere near them, so when the car turned the corner again, I ducked behind some bushes in someone's front yard, hoping they wouldn't see me. I was practically holding my breath, waiting for the sound of the car's engine to fade. It wasn't long before it came again, but this time, they didn't see me. The car went by, and I could hear it make the turn at the next block. I thought maybe they finally gave up and left. Maybe I had gotten away, but I was wrong. I should have stayed hidden longer. I shouldn't have been so eager to leave the safety of the bushes. As soon as I thought the coast was clear, I stood up, brushed the dirt off my pants, and started walking again, this time at a faster pace. But within moments, I heard the sound of that Cadillac coming again. This time, it wasn't just driving by. They saw me. I could hear them hollering from inside the car, their voices sounding even closer now. They were speeding up, and I knew they were coming for me. Panic set in. My mind raced, and I could feel my legs burning as I picked up the pace, but I knew I wouldn't outrun them. I wasn't stupid. I couldn't keep running forever, and they would catch up with me soon. There was only one thing I could think of: hiding again. I saw an apartment building ahead, so I ran toward it, ducking behind some bushes near the entrance. I tried to slow my breathing, hoping they wouldn't see me. I figured they would eventually give up, but I wasn't sure how long I could keep my cool. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't stop trembling. Barely a minute later, I heard footsteps approaching. Someone was coming out of the building. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Would they recognize me as a kid who was running from a car full of strangers? Would they be scared? Or would they think I was doing something wrong? The man who stepped outside was in his late 30s, early 40s. He wasn't particularly tall, but he was broad-shouldered, and even though he wasn't wearing a shirt, I could tell he was fit. His muscles were well-toned, and he had a serious look on his face. He didn't seem angry, just curious. When he saw me hiding in the bushes, he raised an eyebrow and asked, "What are you doing in there?" I didn't know what to say at first. My mind was racing, but I managed to tell him the truth, how I had been walking to my psychiatrist, how I'd been followed and harassed by a group of people in a car, and how I was hiding because I was scared. He could tell I wasn't lying. My voice shook, and I was sure my face was pale. The man just nodded and seemed to understand immediately. Just as he said something to me, I heard the car coming again. I didn't even have to look. I could hear it clearly now. It pulled right up to the curb in front of the apartment, and I could feel my pulse quicken. The people in the car looked at both me and the man standing by the bushes. I could see that the car wasn't as full as before, but there were still a few people inside. I wasn't sure if they'd recognize the guy with me, but they must have decided not to escalate things. The man, without saying a word, just stared at them. He wasn't threatening, but there was something about the way he looked at them that made it clear he wasn't intimidated. After a few tense moments, one of the people in the car asked me, "You know them?" I shook my head, my voice too shaky to respond clearly. "No," I said, barely above a whisper. That seemed to settle things for a moment, but then 3 of the people in the car got out. They were walking toward me, slow and steady. I could feel my stomach drop. It was like everything was falling apart. They were moving to trap me, cut me off, corner me. I had no idea what their plan was, but it didn't look good. But then, before they could get any closer, the man I was with made a quiet but decisive motion. He stepped closer to me, his posture protective, and the 3 of them stopped in their tracks. They hesitated, then quickly turned around and got back into the car. The car sped off, and I could see the rest of them disappear down the street. For a moment, we just stood there, silent. I looked up at the guy, not sure what to say. He asked if I wanted to stay with him for a while, or if I wanted to go into his apartment until I felt safe enough to leave. But I had made up my mind. I was going to continue to my appointment. I didn't want to be late, and I didn't want to feel like I was running from these people anymore. I thanked him, told him I'd be okay, and started walking again, keeping a careful eye on the street. The man went back into his apartment, and the door closed behind him. I watched it for a moment, wondering if I'd made the right choice. But deep down, I felt like I had. I didn't see that car again. The rest of my walk was quiet, uneventful. I got to my psychiatrist's office, shaken but relieved. I told my therapist what had happened, and he insisted on calling the police. I gave them a report, and that was the last I ever heard about it. On my way home that night, I took a different route, avoiding the streets I had walked earlier. I never saw that Cadillac or those people again. It was like they had never existed. I still remember that night, how scared I was, but I also remember that man. He didn't have to help me, but he did. It wasn't just a random act of kindness. It felt like fate stepping in when I needed it most. When I was about 8 years old, recess was usually my favorite part of the day. It was a time when the whole schoolyard buzzed with energy, and everyone scattered across the playground like ants, laughing, yelling, playing games, or sitting around in little groups. The weather that day was chilly, but sunny, the kind of day where the wind stung a little when it whipped across your face, but the sun kept you from needing a jacket. The blacktop was covered in chalk drawings, and a few jump ropes smacked the ground in rhythmic beats off to the side. I had just finished playing tag with a few classmates and was standing around, catching my breath, when I noticed a commotion near the old storage room door that sat along the side of the main building. The storage room wasn't anything special, just a plain, metal door that usually stayed locked. I had never seen it open before. Sometimes a janitor would disappear behind it, fumbling with a big ring of keys, but none of us kids ever went in there. It was like a little mystery tucked into the corner of the playground that nobody really thought much about. Until that day. There was a crowd of kids standing around it, maybe 7 or 8 of them, and they were acting weird, more than weird actually. Their faces were pale, and their voices were frantic as they waved their arms and warned anyone nearby not to go near the door. Their body language alone was enough to stop me in my tracks. Some of them looked genuinely scared, like they had just seen something awful. I could hear snippets of what they were saying, mixed with the wind and the general noise of recess. Don't look through the keyhole. There's something inside. It's looking back at you. Normally, I wasn't the bravest kid around. I was small for my age and didn't like getting into trouble, but something about the way they were acting made my curiosity flare up. It was different from the usual schoolyard dares or stupid jokes. They weren't pretending. They weren't trying to get someone to do something dumb for a laugh. They were scared. That fear almost kept me away, but not quite. I could feel the pull of it, like an invisible rope dragging me closer. I remember stepping toward the door, feeling the crunch of tiny pebbles under my shoes, while the kids tried half-heartedly to stop me without actually getting too close themselves. There was a weird energy in the air, like the moment before a big thunderstorm. I slowed down as I got near the door. It was dented in places, the paint chipped and worn. The keyhole was old and wide, the kind that was big enough to see through if you pressed your eye up to it. I hesitated for just a second. My heart was pounding hard against my ribs, and my hands were a little sweaty even though the air was cold. I bent down slowly, my knees creaking in my jeans, and leaned forward, squinting into the little hole. And I saw it, an eyeball, staring straight back at me. It was so sudden and so real that I didn't even have time to think. It was just there, large and unblinking, filling the whole keyhole, so close it seemed like it could pop through and touch me. The skin around it looked sickly and pale, and the pupil was black and bottomless, fixed right on mine. Something in me just snapped. I gasped so hard it felt like I inhaled the cold air straight into my stomach. My bladder let go, and I peed my pants right there without even realizing it until I felt the warmth running down my legs and pooling around my shoes. My body locked up for a second before I stumbled backwards, falling onto my hands and scraping my palms on the rough concrete. The other kids screamed and backed away even more, their faces twisted in fear. I scrambled to my feet, tears already welling up in my eyes, though I wasn't crying exactly. It was more like my body didn't know what else to do. My mind was blank except for the image of that eyeball, frozen in my head like a horrible photograph. I barely noticed the kids staring at me, whispering, or the few who pointed at the wet stain on my jeans. The yard duty teachers came rushing over after the commotion grew too big to ignore. Their shoes clacked sharply on the pavement, and I remember hearing the shrill sound of the whistle one of them blew to get everyone's attention. My brain was fuzzy, and everything felt like it was happening underwater. One of the teachers grabbed me by the shoulders gently and guided me toward the nurse's office, her hands firm but not unkind. The walk to the nurse's office was a blur. I could feel everyone's eyes on me as I went, my head hanging low, my soaked pants making every step feel 100 times worse. My shoes squished with every move. The hallway inside the building was cooler and darker than outside, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I remember the smell of disinfectant and pencil shavings as I walked, focusing hard on the floor tiles just to keep myself from crying. When I got to the nurse's office, she sat me down gently on a little plastic chair and started asking me questions. I barely heard her. I just kept seeing that over and over again. She gave me a pair of ugly brown sweatpants from the lost and found and helped me clean up. My hands shook as I peeled off my wet jeans and replaced them with the scratchy, too big pants. After a while, the principal came by, his face pinched in that serious way adults have when they know kids have caused a big enough scene that they might have to call parents. He talked to the nurse quietly while I sat on the bench, picking at the peeling vinyl seat. I was too embarrassed to look up. Meanwhile, back outside, things hadn't settled down. Kids kept talking and whispering, and more teachers gathered near the storage room. Eventually, one of the janitors was called over. I think his name was Mr. Hargrove, a big, slow-moving man with a heavy ring of keys always clipped to his belt. I didn't see it happen, but later, when I heard the story from some of the others, they said he walked up to the door, unlocked it, and swung it open wide while a bunch of kids and teachers stood back. And there was nothing inside, just a dusty floor, some metal shelves, and a few stacked boxes. No monster, no stranger, no hidden creature crouching in the dark. But leaning against the inside of the door, right where the keyhole was a mirror. A tall, slightly warped mirror that looked like it had been pulled out of an old classroom or a teacher's lounge. It must have been resting at just the right angle that when you looked through the keyhole, the mirror reflected your own eye back at you. It was our own faces we had seen, distorted slightly by the old glass and the narrow view through the keyhole, making it look unfamiliar and terrifying. Our own eyeballs staring back at us. That was it. Nothing more. When I heard that, sitting there in the nurse's office with my scratchy sweatpants and my scraped-up palms, I felt a weird mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved. There hadn't been some horrible thing lurking behind that door. Part of me was angry too, though, like I had been tricked somehow even though nobody had meant to trick me. Mostly, I just felt stupid, embarrassed, ashamed. But looking back now, as an adult, I can see it for what it really was, a simple mistake. A moment where fear got the better of us, where our own minds filled in the blanks with something scary, because that's just what people do sometimes, especially when they're young and don't understand the world yet. I still remember that eyeball, clear as day, but I also remember what came after. How the teacher sat us down and explained everything calmly, how the janitor showed us the mirror and let a few kids peek through the door again. This time with the door open wide and the mirror clearly visible, so we could see it for ourselves. I even remember laughing a little, though it was a nervous laugh, with a sour twist in my stomach. The rest of the day passed slowly. I stayed inside for the next recess, sitting in the classroom coloring quietly while the others went back out to play. Nobody really made fun of me too much after that. A few kids snickered, sure, but it faded quickly, like most things do when you're 8 years old and something new and more interesting happens the next day. When my mom picked me up after school, she gave me a puzzled look when she saw my brown sweatpants, but she didn't press me too hard for answers. I think the school must have called her beforehand, because she just sighed and ruffled my hair before leading me to the car. The ride home was quiet, the sun starting to sink low in the sky, and I watched the trees blur past the window, feeling both older and smaller than I had that morning. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that eye again, huge and staring. But as the days went by, the fear faded. It became just another memory, one of those strange, vivid things that sticks with you from childhood, more funny than scary once enough time passes. And now, when I think about it, I realize it taught me something important in its own weird way. Sometimes, the things we're most afraid of aren't really out there, hiding in the dark. Sometimes they're just our own reflections staring back at us, twisted a little by fear and imagination. And sometimes all it takes to get past that fear is opening the door wide and letting the light in. I was exhausted, bone-tired really. It was late, about midnight, and I was still cleaning after my family had left from Easter dinner. My mother and aunt had thrown the dinner and then gone out for drinks afterward, leaving me to deal with the mess. I didn't mind it all that much. In fact, I'd gotten used to the chaos. My grandmother, Nana, had had a severe stroke a few months ago that had left her completely paralyzed on one side of her body. She couldn't speak at all anymore, but she could still make sounds. I took care of her now, as best I could, and it was a lot of work. Most days, I felt like I was running on fumes, but I did it. It was just part of my life now. Tonight, though, it was quiet. For once, I had actually managed to get her into bed without too much trouble. That wasn't always the case. Nana had been acting strange for the past week or so. She'd been having these episodes where, shortly after I'd put her to bed, she'd start screaming. I'd rush in, find her sobbing, pulling at her hair in fear. It was heartbreaking. I'd ask her questions, a lot of yes or no ones, trying to understand what had her so terrified. She couldn't talk, and that made it incredibly hard. She'd point to things, to places in the room, to photographs of her dead parents, and sometimes she'd kiss a crucifix she never cared for in her life. But tonight, she was peaceful. For now, anyway. So there I was, standing in the living room, trying to clean up the mess left behind from the dinner. I was picking up towels that had been carelessly thrown around, folding them, and moving them into the kitchen when I heard it. Voices. It wasn't the kind of voice you'd expect from a TV show or something coming from a different room. It was much closer than that. Men's voices, clearly talking, laughing, carrying on. I froze. I was certain that somehow I'd hit the remote control and turned on the TV, even though I'd just put it down on the counter, and it was well out of sight. I stood there for a moment, listening. It didn't sound right. The voices were far too clear. I stepped forward, the prickling sensation crawling down my spine as I tried to shake it off. I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, where the sound was coming from, but as I got closer, the voices seemed to fade away. It was almost as though they had melted into the sound of water running in the pipes. My heart was still racing. I was overtired. I had to be. Maybe the sound of the water had tricked me. Maybe I hadn't been paying attention. But it didn't end there. As I turned back toward the towels, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Papers. They were scattered all over the floor, papers that had been neatly stacked on the table just moments before. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't justify it. I picked them up, putting them back where they belonged, then headed into the kitchen to get some dishes. When I walked past the bathroom, the door was slightly ajar, and I could see something moving inside. A small figure, a man in a hat, dancing. My first reaction was disbelief. There's no way this was happening. But I was too tired to even deal with it. I just shut the door to the bathroom, pretending I hadn't seen a thing. I continued my cleaning, ignoring the tightening in my chest, trying to stay focused. But as I went to grab some dishes from the table, I stopped short. Right there on the floor, in the dead center of the kitchen, was the TV cable. The cable that belonged to the deadbolt room. The room that nobody had opened since my family left. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I bent to pick it up. My stomach twisted in a knot, but I refused to acknowledge what was happening. This was all just exhaustion. Nothing more. I forced myself to keep going. I put the cable on the table and scrubbed a few dishes. I hummed to myself, the sound of my voice filling the room as a reminder that I was in control. I was fine. I wasn't going to let myself get worked up. But then came the knock. 3 loud raps, like someone was tapping on the bottom of the kitchen sink. I froze, the dish I was holding slipping from my hands and crashing into the sink. The sound echoed through the room, louder than I expected. I stood there, staring at the broken dish, trying to convince myself that I had just dropped it, that it had somehow bounced against the sink. But no, I hadn't dropped it like that. That noise hadn't come from me. I waited. Silence. It was almost too quiet, and the tension in the air was unbearable. I was still standing there, trying to figure out what the hell just happened when it came again. Louder this time. A knock from inside the cabinet, like something was crouching beneath the sink and tapping on the wood with its knuckles. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I picked up another dish, this time almost cautiously, and dropped it. I needed to know if I was causing that sound, if it was just an echo of me moving things around. There was a pause. Then the sound came again, knocking twice, deliberate and slow. The cabinet door creaked open. Not from the outside, like a door left ajar by accident, but from inside. It swung out, hitting my knee with a jolt. Twice. The second knock, I felt it, the sting in my joint, and my whole body stiffened. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I dropped the dish I was holding with a clatter and bolted out of the kitchen. I didn't even look back. I rushed into the living room, grabbed a chair, and sat down, repeating the Lord's Prayer over and over in a low whisper. My hands were shaking. My legs felt weak. The whole room seemed to hum with a strange energy that I couldn't explain. And that's when the strangest thing happened. The air seemed to settle. The tension left, like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I stayed there, in the living room, staring at the floor, trying to calm my breathing. My heart was still racing, but the feeling of something being wrong, it was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. My eyes kept darting toward Nana's room. It was so quiet, so still. I kept listening, waiting for any signs that something was wrong. But nothing. Nana didn't scream. She didn't pull at her hair. The house stayed quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet as I paced back and forth. The next morning, when I went to check on Nana, she was calm. Her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled at me a weak, tired smile. But it was a smile, and that was more than I had expected after everything the night before. I helped her sit up, gave her some water, and checked her vitals. I could tell that she was still a little on edge, still not quite herself. But she didn't scream. She didn't cry. And for that, I was thankful. The days passed without incident. Nana never had another episode, and the strange happenings in the house seemed to stop altogether. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what had happened that night. But whatever it was, it had stayed away. That was the last time I experienced anything like that in that house. And to this day, I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, if it was exhaustion, or if something real had been trying to get my attention. All I know is that it was the scariest night of my life, and after it, I never took the silence of that house for granted again. It was a hot summer afternoon, the kind where the sun sits high in the sky and makes everything feel a little slower, a little heavier. I had just finished my shift at work and was walking home like I did most days. The walk wasn't too long, maybe about 40 minutes if I didn't stop anywhere, and most of it took me through my local park. It was a pretty big park, full of grassy areas, winding paths, tall trees that gave off some much-needed shade, and a few scattered playgrounds. In the daytime, it was lively and safe. People laid out picnic blankets, couples walked hand in hand, families chased their kids around. Someone was usually playing music somewhere, the kind of muffled pop songs you could hear floating across the open space. You could hear the occasional bark of a dog chasing after a ball, or the distant squeak of swings rocking back and forth. By night, though, it was a different story. Everyone in town knew you didn't want to be in that park after dark. Bad things had happened there before. Muggings mostly, sometimes worse. But in the middle of the afternoon like this, with the sky bright and blue and the park full of people, it felt safe. I'd done this walk hundreds of times without even thinking about it. It was part of my routine. There was a shortcut I always took, an old, narrow gate tucked away halfway through the park. It was easy to miss if you didn't know it was there, hidden between two thick hedges. The gate led out onto a quieter side street that took me straight home. I liked that shortcut. It saved me a few minutes, and it meant I didn't have to walk along the busier main road, with all its noise and traffic. That afternoon, I could already feel the sweat starting to build on my back from the heat, the collar of my work shirt sticking slightly to my skin. I shifted my bag on my shoulder and made my way across the grass, heading towards the gate like I always did. I wasn't in any rush, but I wasn't dragging my feet either. I just wanted to get home, kick my shoes off, maybe put a fan on and have a cold drink. As I walked, I noticed something a little odd. There were two guys standing right in front of the gate. At first glance, nothing about them screamed danger. They looked pretty young, maybe early 20s like me, dressed in casual clothes, jeans, t-shirts. One of them was wearing a cap, pulled low over his eyes. They looked like they were just hanging out. But something about the way they were positioned set off a quiet alarm in the back of my head. They weren't leaning casually or looking relaxed. They were standing stiff, alert, almost like they were waiting for something. For someone. I hesitated for a second, my steps slowing a little. I couldn't explain it exactly. It was just a gut feeling, one of those things that doesn't make logical sense but still feels important. A warning, buzzing under my skin. I thought about veering off, pretending I needed to check something on my phone, maybe taking a longer way around. But then I told myself I was being stupid, paranoid. It was broad daylight, for God's sake. There were people around. Not right next to me, but in the distance, I could see a man tossing a ball for his dog, a woman pushing a stroller, a few teenagers lying on the grass listening to music. It wasn't like I was alone. I told myself to stop being ridiculous. I kept walking towards the gate. As I got closer, one of the guys stepped back a little, almost casually, and then disappeared out of sight behind a bush that grew up alongside the path. At first I thought he was just moving to make space, but the way he ducked down didn't seem right. It was too quick, too deliberate. My stomach tightened. I glanced towards the other guy still standing in front of the gate. He suddenly called out to me, loudly, asking for the time. I didn't answer. I didn't even break my stride. Something was seriously wrong. I could feel it now, a hard knot of fear growing inside my chest. My eyes flicked around without moving my head too much. That's when I saw it. There was a car parked just a little ways down the path, half hidden behind another row of bushes. The car was nothing special, just an old sedan, dirty with dust. But what made my blood run cold was what I saw next. There were more figures crouched alongside the car. At least 2 more guys, maybe 3. It was hard to tell, but I saw the shapes of them, low to the ground, hiding. Waiting. I didn't even think. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I turned sharply on my heel and started walking back the way I came. Fast, but trying not to look like I was running. The guy at the gate called out again, louder this time, but I kept my head down and didn't respond. My heart was hammering so hard in my chest, I could feel it pounding in my ears. Every step felt like I was moving through wet sand, like I couldn't get away fast enough. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if they were following me. I just focused on getting to the next exit. There was another gate across the park, bigger and more open, leading out onto a busier street. It wasn't close. I had to cross a wide open field first. I felt horribly exposed, like I had a target on my back. The afternoon sun that had felt warm and comforting before now felt sharp and oppressive, making the sweat drip down my spine. Every little sound, the buzz of insects, the distant bark of a dog, made me jump. I walked faster, my legs stiff, my mouth dry. I passed a few people on the way, a jogger, a man sitting on a bench looking at his phone, but I didn't say anything to them. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know for sure if the guys were behind me. I just knew I had to get out of there. When I finally reached the bigger gate, I practically burst through it, stepping onto the sidewalk like it was sacred ground. Cars rushed past on the street. People strolled along the pavement. Shops and cafes buzzed with life. I blended into the crowd as quickly as I could, turning a few corners, weaving between strangers. Only then did I risk a glance back. I didn't see anyone. No one out of place. No one running after me. But that didn't make me feel better. I kept moving, fast, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly hold onto my bag. My mind was racing, flashing through everything that had just happened, replaying it again and again. If I had kept walking, if I had stopped to answer, if I had hesitated even for a second longer. It was only when I finally reached my building, a good 15 minutes later, that I allowed myself to slow down. Even then, my fingers fumbled with the keys, dropping them once, twice, before I managed to fit them into the lock. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, double locking it, sliding the chain across. Only then did I lean back against the door, breathing hard, my whole body trembling. I stood there for a long time, just listening. The sounds of my apartment, normal, familiar, slowly seeped back into my awareness. The hum of the fridge, the distant thud of footsteps from the apartment above, the muted whoosh of cars passing by outside. It was over. I was safe. I stumbled to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and drank it down in huge gulps, my hands still unsteady. I had to sit down. I collapsed onto the couch, feeling every muscle in my body aching from the tension. My mind kept spinning, unable to settle. I thought about how close it had been, how easy it would have been for things to go wrong, how I had almost walked straight into whatever they had planned. I don't know exactly what would have happened if I hadn't trusted that gut feeling. I don't need to know. I know enough. The way they were positioned, the way they tried to distract me, the hidden car, the extra guys crouched out of sight. It wasn't random. It wasn't innocent. Something bad was about to happen. I could feel it deep in my bones. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I walked home, every time I stepped into that park, I remembered. Even in broad daylight, I found myself scanning every face, every shadow. I stopped using the shortcut completely. I started taking longer, busier routes, sticking to main roads where there were always people around. I told myself it was an overreaction, that I was being too cautious, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Sometimes being cautious is what keeps you alive. Even now, years later, I think about that day. I remember the heat of the sun, the bright colors of the grass and trees, the normal sounds of people enjoying their afternoon. And I remember the cold, hard knot of fear that took hold of me and refused to let go. I remember how close I came to making a terrible mistake, and how a split-second decision might have saved my life. I'm grateful that I listened to my instincts. Grateful that I didn't let embarrassment or politeness trap me. Sometimes you don't get a second chance. Sometimes you have to run when every part of you is screaming that something isn't right, even if you can't explain it, even if you're afraid of looking stupid. I'll never forget that feeling. I don't want to forget it, because it's the feeling that kept me safe, that day when everything seemed normal until it wasn't. And I never used that shortcut again. I was a kid when this happened, and I can still remember it so clearly. It's one of those memories that has stuck with me over the years, even though at the time, I didn't think much of it. When I was young, my great-grandmother lived with my grandparents. She was getting up there in age, and while we weren't super close, I always had a soft spot for her. Whenever I visited, she'd be sitting in her chair, usually knitting or reading, and without fail, when I walked into the room, she'd smile at me. Sometimes she'd give me a little thumbs up too. I don't know why, but it always made me giggle a little. I think it was just the way her eyes twinkled, like she was in on a secret, even though I didn't understand what that secret was. She passed away when I was younger, and like I said, we weren't super close, so I didn't really feel the deep grief that some of the other family members did. But her death still affected me in a way I didn't fully understand. I didn't cry much, but I did find myself thinking about her more than usual. It was like she was still around, even though I knew she wasn't. And the weird thing was, I kept remembering that thumbs up of hers. Even though I didn't see her often, I remembered it so vividly. I guess it was one of those little things that stuck with me. I was walking home from school one day when the thought of her popped into my head again. I was near the end of my walk, just thinking about my great-grandma and that little thumbs up. It wasn't anything special in the grand scheme of things, but for some reason, that memory had a weird hold on me. I smiled to myself, not expecting anything unusual to happen. When I got home, I ran straight downstairs to my room. We had a finished basement, and I was always excited to get down there. The stairs were steep, and the landing at the bottom of the steps was tight. There was a gate at the bottom, and above it, the ceiling wasn't much higher than 7 feet, so anyone taller than average had to duck when coming down. It wasn't a big space, but it was cozy in a way. I always liked it, even though it was kind of dark, and the only light came from the small window at the top of the stairs. I was running down those stairs like I usually did, not thinking too much about it. But halfway down, something went wrong. My foot slipped on the edge of the stair, and I lost my balance. There was that brief moment of panic, that feeling of everything happening too fast to control, like when you're falling but can't quite react in time. It all happened so quickly, and I thought for sure I was going to crash, maybe hit the ceiling or the gate at the bottom. But I didn't. Instead, I landed softly, almost like the air itself cushioned my fall. I didn't hit anything. I didn't stumble or crash into the gate. I was just there, on the ground, standing still, not hurt at all. My first thought wasn't about how lucky I was or how strange it was that I had landed so softly. My first thought was about my grandma. I don't know why. It didn't make sense, but in that moment, the first thing that came to mind was her smile. And then, as clear as anything, I remembered her little thumbs up. I stood there for a second, my feet still firmly planted on the ground, feeling like something had just happened, but not being able to explain it. It wasn't like anything supernatural had occurred. It wasn't like I'd been saved by a ghost or anything like that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, in that split second, something had guided me down safely, or at least helped me land without getting hurt. It wasn't rational, I know that now, but back then, it felt real, like she had somehow been there, looking out for me, even though she was gone. I remember standing there for a while, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I don't know if it was my imagination running wild, or if I really had experienced something out of the ordinary. But it stuck with me. The memory stayed clear in my mind for years. It wasn't like I thought about it every day, but when I did, it always felt so vivid. The way I had tripped, the way I had landed, and then, that flash of my grandma's smile and thumbs up. It was strange, but not in a creepy or unsettling way. Just unexpected, I guess. The thing is, even as I got older, I could still remember it as clearly as if it had just happened. I don't know if it was the shock of tripping down those stairs, or just the timing of everything, but it felt like something bigger than me had been at play. It's not that I think my grandma was there in any ghostly sense, but in that moment, I felt like maybe she had been watching over me, even if just for a second. Maybe it was a silly thought for a kid to have, but it made me feel comforted. It made me smile, just like she had done when I was younger. Now, as an adult, I still think about it sometimes. I don't know what happened that day, but it was one of those experiences that stuck with me. I don't have an explanation for it, and I don't think I ever will. But I do know that it was a moment in my life that, for whatever reason, made me feel connected to someone who was gone. I didn't need to understand it. I didn't need it to make sense. All I knew was that in that moment, it felt like my grandma was still out there, giving me that little thumbs up of reassurance, like she always had. I've never told anyone about that day. Maybe because it sounds silly, or maybe because it's one of those things that's just too personal. But now, looking back on it, I can't help but think that it wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe it was just the right timing, or maybe it was my own mind playing tricks on me. But either way, I'll always remember it. The fall, the landing, and that brief moment when I felt like she was there with me again. It's one of those memories that, for better or worse, is burned into my mind. I guess that's the strange thing about memories. Sometimes, you have these moments in your life that don't make sense, but they stay with you, and you can't really shake them. Even if there's no logical explanation for them, they stick, and you find yourself revisiting them years later, trying to figure out what they meant. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something more than that. I'll never know for sure. But what I do know is that every time I think about my great-grandma, I remember that thumbs up. And in some strange, comforting way, I still feel like she's out there, smiling at me, watching over me. When I was in 3rd grade, I had a teacher named Mrs. Todd. She was a short woman, probably not even 5 feet tall, with curly dark hair that she wore in a tight bun most days. Her glasses were always slipping down her nose, and she had this permanent smile that made her seem like she was always happy to see you. She wore bright, colorful clothes too, lots of pinks and purples and dresses with patterns that looked like they belonged in a kid's book. From the first day I walked into her classroom, she was always really nice to me. Way nicer than any other teacher I ever had. Every time there was something fun to do, like passing out supplies or picking people for little activities, she would call on me first. I remember how good it felt. Like I was her favorite. She would say things like, "What a good job you're doing," or, "I knew you'd be the perfect one for this." At that age, it just made me feel special. Like I mattered more than the other kids somehow. I would go home and tell my mom how much I loved Mrs. Todd, how lucky I was to have her as my teacher. It wasn't just that she picked me for things. Even when I made mistakes, she would smile and tell me it was okay. When I finished work early, she would let me draw or read a book instead of making me do extra worksheets like some of the other teachers did. I started looking forward to school in a way I never had before. I would sit at the breakfast table excited for the day to start, wondering what kind of fun things she might pick me for that day. Our classroom was one of those older ones, with big wooden desks that had a lid you could lift up and a pull-out drawer underneath for pencils and erasers. The floors were that yellowy-brown linoleum that always looked kind of dirty even after it had been cleaned. Our desks were in neat rows, and we each had a cubby at the back of the room for coats and backpacks. The windows were tall and let in a lot of sunlight in the mornings, and there was always the faint smell of crayons and glue in the air. One morning, I walked into class like normal. It was just before the bell, and the room was loud with the sounds of kids talking and laughing. I made my way to my desk and sat down, reaching to open the drawer so I could put away some stuff I had brought from home, just a library book and some pencils. When I pulled the drawer open, though, something stopped me cold. Inside, right there on top of the paper scraps and broken crayons, was a Victoria's Secret magazine. At first, I didn't even understand what I was looking at. I mean, I knew what it was. I had seen the commercials on TV before, but it didn't make sense that it would be in my desk. I just stared at it, frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. I had this sudden fear that I was in big trouble somehow, that someone was going to come by, see it, and think I had brought it. The kid who sat next to me, a boy named Chris, leaned over and saw what I was staring at. His eyes got wide too. He whispered something to me, but I was so freaked out I didn't even really hear what he said. We started whispering back and forth, trying to figure out how it had gotten there. Neither of us could come up with anything that made sense. I felt this tight knot forming in my stomach. I thought maybe I was going to cry or throw up or something. Then, just as we were talking, I saw Mrs. Todd walking toward us. She had that same bright smile on her face, like she always did. I snapped the drawer shut, but it was too late. She had seen that something was up. She came right over and asked what I had there. I tried to explain that I had just found it when I opened the desk, but everything came out jumbled and nervous. I could feel my cheeks burning with embarrassment. I remember thinking over and over, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. Mrs. Todd looked at me for a long second, then looked over at Chris. Then she said, real calm and sweet, that Chris must have put it there. She said it like it was just a fact, something obvious that everyone knew. Chris started trying to explain too, but she just kept saying it again and again, that he must have put it there, that there wasn't any other explanation. I remember feeling so confused. I didn't think Chris had done it. I didn't even think he would have been able to get something like that. But Mrs. Todd kept insisting, and she was the teacher. She was the adult. She was the one who was supposed to know everything. Eventually, after what felt like forever, I just nodded and said that maybe Chris had put it there. I didn't know what else to do. I felt so small and scared and wrong, even though I hadn't done anything. After that, everything kind of went back to normal, at least on the surface. Mrs. Todd still smiled at me, still picked me first for activities, still complimented me all the time. I kept telling myself that maybe it really had just been some weird accident, that it didn't mean anything. I was just a kid, and I wanted to believe that the adults around me were always good and safe and right. A few days after the magazine thing, Mrs. Todd pulled me aside after class. The room was mostly empty by then. The other kids had already rushed out to the buses. The sunlight was slanting in through the windows, and the classroom felt strangely quiet. She knelt down next to my desk, so we were eye level, smiling that same wide, bright smile. She told me that she was so proud of me, that I was doing such a great job in class. She said there was going to be a special trip for students who were doing really well, and that I might be able to go if I kept up the good work. She said it would just be me and her, going to the Gulf of Mexico for the weekend. We could see the beach, go swimming, and do all kinds of fun things. At the time, I was thrilled. I didn't think anything of it. A trip to the beach? Just me and my favorite teacher? It sounded like the best thing in the world. I practically floated out of the school that day, my head full of images of sandcastles and seashells and the bright blue water. I don't know if she ever really planned the trip, or if she was just testing to see how I would react. Either way, it never happened. Maybe a week or two after that conversation, Mrs. Todd stopped coming to school. One morning, we walked into the classroom, and there was a substitute there instead. He was an older man with a gray mustache and a serious face. At first, everyone thought it was just for a day or two, but then a new permanent teacher showed up. She was younger, stricter, and didn't seem to like me very much. No more picking me first. No more compliments. I didn't understand what had happened. No one really explained anything to us. I just knew that Mrs. Todd was gone, and I missed her. I missed her more than I probably should have. I remember feeling angry at the new teacher for not being as nice. I would sit at my desk, tracing the edge of the drawer with my finger, remembering the way Mrs. Todd used to smile at me. It wasn't until years later, when I was much older, that I started thinking about it differently. When I was in high school, and then even more when I was in college, I would remember that magazine in my desk, how Mrs. Todd had reacted, how she had blamed Chris so quickly. I would remember that offer for the trip, just me and her, to a place hours and hours away. The pieces started to fit together in ways I didn't like. I realized that what had seemed like kindness wasn't normal, that no teacher should have been acting the way she did, picking a favorite, isolating me from the other kids, offering private trips, making me feel special in a way that didn't belong in a classroom. It made me feel sick to think about it, to realize how vulnerable I had been, how easy it had been for her to make me trust her completely, how close something bad might have happened without me even knowing it. I thought about the timing too, how right after the magazine thing and after the trip offer, she suddenly disappeared, how the school had never explained it. Had they found out? Had someone noticed something was wrong? Had some other kid said something? I would never know for sure. All I knew was that one day she was there, smiling and complimenting me, and the next she was gone. For a long time, those memories made me feel confused and dirty, even though I had done nothing wrong. I felt embarrassed, ashamed, even though I knew deep down that none of it had been my fault. I was just a little kid who wanted to be liked, who wanted to feel special. Now, as an adult, when I look back, I feel something else too. I feel grateful. Grateful that whatever was going to happen didn't happen. That she was stopped, somehow, before anything worse could happen. I think about all the things that could have gone differently. About how lucky I was that my story didn't end up the way so many others have. It scares me still to think about it. About how predators don't always look scary. Sometimes they look like the nicest person in the world. Sometimes they look like someone you would trust with anything. Someone you would have told your mother you loved. But it also reminds me to be careful. To teach my own kids, one day, that trust has to be earned, not just given. That even the nicest smile can hide the worst intentions. It's not a happy memory, but it's a true one, and it taught me something I needed to learn, even if it took years for me to understand it. When I was 7 years old, I walked to my babysitter's house by myself all the time. It wasn't far, just a block or so from the schoolyard, maybe a 5-minute walk at most if you didn't stop to pick up rocks or kick leaves around. The streets in my neighborhood were quiet, the houses close together with chain-link fences, or sometimes just patches of yard separating them. Everyone seemed to know everyone, or at least it felt that way when you were a kid. It wasn't a big town, just a small place where you felt safe walking around even if you were little. I remember it was late fall, maybe October. The trees were half bare, their branches crooked and claw-like against a gray sky. Piles of dead leaves gathered along the curbs, damp from a rain the night before, and the air had that cold, wet smell that seeps into your jacket. I had my backpack swinging from one shoulder, weighed down with my reading book and a crumpled-up brown paper lunch bag. My boots scuffed along the sidewalk, and I remember staring at the cracks in the pavement, hopping over them like stepping stones, feeling good and free like I always did after school. That's when the car pulled up. I didn't notice it at first, just the rumble of an engine slowing down. I thought maybe it was one of the neighbors, or someone's mom coming home early. But the sound stayed beside me. I looked up and there it was, a beat-up old sedan, the paint a dull, dirty white, the passenger side mirror hanging on by some wires. The window was rolled down, and a man was leaning over from the driver's seat, waving his arm at me like he was trying to catch my attention. He was shouting. I couldn't hear the words at first, not clearly. It was like my brain couldn't quite believe someone was yelling at me. But he kept gesturing, his hand moving faster, more aggressive, his face twisted with frustration. Come here. Come here. I froze. I stopped right where I was on the sidewalk, my boots scraping against the concrete. I shook my head, small, sharp jerks like maybe if I said no hard enough, he'd just leave. My fingers clenched around the strap of my backpack, so tightly they hurt. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest, hard and heavy, like it was trying to get out. The man kept shouting, getting louder. Then suddenly he stopped. His face changed, like he remembered something important he had to tell me. His mouth moved slower, and he said, clear enough that I could never forget it, "Stay away from Christina." And then he slammed the car into gear and drove off, tires squealing a little as he sped around the corner and out of sight. I stood there, shaking, not sure if I should run or cry or just stand there until someone came. Nobody was around. It was just me and the empty sidewalk and the wet leaves blowing around my boots. I don't know how long I stood there before my legs finally moved, and I started running toward my babysitter's house, not stopping until I was pounding on her front door, gasping for breath. I didn't tell anyone right away. I don't know why. Maybe I was scared they wouldn't believe me. Maybe I just wanted it to go away. My babysitter asked why I was out of breath and so pale, and I mumbled something about running and being cold. She gave me a hot chocolate and turned on cartoons, and by the time my parents picked me up later that evening, I didn't say a word. Days passed, and then weeks, and somehow the memory of that man faded into the background. I was 7. The world moves fast when you're 7. There were spelling tests and picture days and birthdays to think about. Halloween came and went, and soon after that, Christmas lights started going up. I kept being friends, on and off, with Christina. We were in the same grade, same small class, just like always. One week we were best friends, passing notes and braiding each other's hair at recess. The next week, we weren't speaking because she said I was too bossy, or I said she was too mean. That's just how it was with little kids, especially in a town where your choices of friends were whoever sat next to you every day. There was another girl too, one who was part of our little circle, who also couldn't seem to make up her mind if she liked me or hated me. One day she'd invite me to sleepovers. The next she'd spread rumors about me whispering behind cupped hands. I got used to it. I thought that's just how friendships worked. By 5th grade, things should have gotten better. We were older, supposed to be smarter, supposed to be moving past all the silly kid drama. But somehow it felt worse. People started getting meaner in ways that were sharper, more cutting. It wasn't just teasing anymore. It was whisper campaigns, cold shoulders, sudden outbursts. You could never be sure if someone was really your friend, or if they were just waiting to humiliate you the next time you turned your back. One day at lunch, that other girl, the one who alternated between liking and hating me, came up and asked if I wanted to go get a pop from the vending machines in the back hall. I said yes right away. I was so excited to be included that I didn't even think twice. Getting called away like that, being singled out, felt special. Like maybe today was going to be a good day for once. The hallways were mostly empty, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the squeak of our shoes on the tile floor. We each bought a drink, laughing about how cold it was in that part of the school, our breath puffing little clouds. I remember standing there, looking cold in my hands, feeling like maybe I had a real friend after all. When we got back to the classroom, Christina was waiting by my desk. She was smiling too big, her cheeks pink like she'd been running or laughing too hard. She said in this weird, syrupy voice that some people had been messing with my lunch, but she had been nice enough to bring it back for me. She pointed to my bag sitting neatly on my chair. I thought it was weird, but again, I didn't think too hard about it. I was used to weirdness by then. I sat down, opened my bag, pulled out my sandwich and my pop. I was thirsty, so I opened the can first, took a big swig. Immediately, something was wrong. The taste hit me like a slap. Sharp, chemical, burning my tongue and the roof of my mouth. I gagged and spit it out onto the floor without even thinking, dropping the can with a loud clatter. My mouth was burning, my eyes watering. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the water fountain just outside the door, shoving my mouth under the stream and gulping as fast as I could, trying to wash it away. Other kids started gathering around, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. My throat hurt, and my mouth felt like it was coated in something nasty, bitter and sour all at once. A teacher noticed the commotion and came over, and suddenly there were a lot of adults asking questions, pulling me aside, looking at the can, sniffing it. The smell coming out of the pop can was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. It stung the nose, sharp and bitter. Lysol. Someone had poured Lysol into my drink. It didn't take long to figure out who. There were only a few people who had been near my desk. Christina, her sister, who was older but still hanging around the elementary wing sometimes. The girl who invited me to the vending machine. The police were called. Not just school staff, real police officers with badges and heavy boots that echoed down the hallways. I had to sit in a little office and tell them everything I remembered, feeling smaller and smaller every time they asked a question. I don't know everything that happened behind closed doors, but I know Christina and her sister got suspended. 3 days for Christina, 4 for her sister. I know their parents were called in. There were a lot of meetings, a lot of papers being signed. There was even a restraining order put in place, although it didn't mean much when there were only 2 classes per grade and barely a dozen kids in each. They were still there. They still showed up every day after their suspensions, sitting on the other side of the room, whispering and laughing with each other. They weren't allowed to talk to me, but that didn't stop them from glaring, from smirking when they thought no teachers were looking. And me, I kept showing up too. Every day. I kept my head down, kept my eyes on my work. I didn't have many friends after that. People didn't want to pick sides, didn't want to get involved. It was easier for them to act like nothing happened. After a while, even I started acting like nothing happened. It was easier than being the weird kid who almost got poisoned. But I never forgot. I never forgot the taste of that drink, or the burning in my mouth, or the way Christina's smile didn't quite reach her eyes when she handed me my lunch. And I never forgot the man in the car. Who was he? How did he know? Was he trying to help me or scare me? Sometimes I thought maybe he was a relative of someone Christina had hurt before. Maybe she had done something bad before me, and someone had sent a warning, too little too late. Sometimes I wondered if he was just some random crazy person, and the fact he mentioned Christina was some horrible coincidence. But deep down, I think he knew. I think he saw something nobody else wanted to see. Years later, when I was older and wiser and had more words for the things that happened to me, I looked back and realized how much danger I had been in, how close I had come to getting seriously hurt, or worse, how easily adults around me brushed it off, treated it like kid drama gone a little too far. Christina moved away before high school. Her family packed up and left town one summer without much warning. There were rumors, of course. There were always rumors. Some said they left because her dad got a new job. Others whispered that it had something to do with trouble Christina had gotten into, but nobody ever had any real answers. I never saw her again. The girl who took me to the vending machine stayed in town, but we were never friends after that. I kept my distance, learned to trust my gut when someone's smile didn't feel right. I grew up. I went to high school, then college. I built a life far away from that small town and its empty streets and cracked sidewalks. But every so often, something will happen. A car slowing down beside me on the street, the smell of Lysol in a grocery store aisle, and I'll be right back there, frozen on the sidewalk, clutching my backpack, I was sitting at my computer, hunched over the desk, the dull blue light from the monitor the only thing lighting up my room. The rest of the house was silent and dark. It was late, probably close to 2 or 3 in the morning, though I hadn't checked the clock in a while. Time didn't really feel real at that hour anyway. I had my headphones on, half listening to some quiet instrumental playlist to keep me focused while I worked. The rest of my family was asleep, had been for hours. I was just trying to finish up a few things before I crashed myself. It wasn't unusual for me to stay up this late, especially while I was staying here. Every year, for as long as I could remember, I'd spend a few weeks in this house. It was almost like a second home. Same creaky floorboards, same uneven door frames, same carpet that felt weirdly rough under your feet. I knew it all by heart. The layout was burned into my memory. I didn't need lights to find my way around. At least, that's what I thought. Around 2:30, I started feeling the need to pee. I ignored it for a while, thinking I could just power through and finish what I was doing, but eventually it got to be too much. With a sigh, I pulled off my headphones, set them on the desk, and stood up. My chair gave a tiny squeak as it rocked back into place behind me. I stretched for a second, hearing a few satisfying pops from my back, then moved toward the door. I was careful not to make any noise. The walls were thin in this house, and sound traveled like crazy. Even just opening the door felt like a test of skill. I turned the handle slowly, gently, and eased the door open. It made the faintest little click as it reached the end of its arc. I winced at even that much noise, pausing for a second to listen. Nothing. The house stayed silent. I stepped out into the darkness. It was black out there. No night lights, no hallway lamps. Just pure, solid darkness. The only thing I could see was a little square of faint light spilling out from my computer screen through the crack of my still cracked door behind me. After that, nothing. But I wasn't worried. I didn't need to see. I knew the way. From my door, it was a few steps forward, then a left turn, another few steps, another left, then straight down the hall to the bathroom. Easy. I could do it half asleep. I had plenty of times before. I shuffled forward carefully, brushing my fingers lightly against the wall to guide me. I counted my steps out of habit. 1, 2, 3, then the first left turn. My bare feet brushed against the transition from the rough carpet of my room to the smoother wood of the hallway. I felt the corner of the wall with my hand and pivoted. Another few steps forward. The second left turn came up just like I expected. I made the turn and padded quietly down the hallway, aiming for the bathroom door. I found the doorknob, twisted it open, and stepped inside. Unlike the hallway, the bathroom had a tiny window up high that let in a little silver moonlight. It wasn't much, but it was enough that I could see where the light switch was without fumbling. I clicked it on, squinting as the brightness stung my eyes for a second, then went about my business. The whole thing took maybe a minute. I finished up, washed my hands quickly, flicked the light off, and stepped back out into the pitch-black hallway. This was the part that always felt a little creepy, but in a familiar, harmless way. I mean, being in total darkness is just naturally unsettling, right? But I knew there was nothing out there. Just walls, doors, and the sleeping breaths of family members tucked safely into their beds. I closed the bathroom door behind me as quietly as I could and put my hand back on the wall to guide myself again. I knew the way back. Straight, a right turn, a few steps, another right, and back into my room. Easy. The air felt a little cooler out here than in my room. The floor was cold under my bare feet, and the silence was almost heavy. It pressed in on my ears, made me hyper-aware of every tiny noise. The soft creak of the wood under my weight, the faint whir of the ceiling fan back in my room. I made the first few steps without a problem. I reached the corner and made my first right turn, brushing my fingertips lightly along the wall. It was all muscle memory. I wasn't even really thinking about it. That's when I thought I saw something move. It was just for a split second. A quick, dark shape, like a shadow slipping across my path. I froze immediately, my whole body going stiff. My heart gave a sudden, hard thump against my ribs. I blinked into the darkness, straining to see. But there was nothing, just black. I stood there for a long moment, listening. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, but nothing else. No footsteps, no breathing. Just silence. Probably just my imagination, I told myself. A trick of the darkness. My eyes trying too hard to make sense of nothing. That's all. I took a cautious step forward. There it was again. Movement. Quick, silent, and way too close this time. It had come from right where my room should have been. A shape slipping towards me, fast and smooth, like it was gliding. I stopped dead, every muscle in my body locking up. My hand pressed flat against the wall. I stared into the darkness, willing my eyes to adjust faster, to make sense of what I was seeing. I couldn't. It was just too dark. Panic started to simmer low in my gut. I could feel it bubbling up, my body shifting subtly towards fight or flight without me even thinking about it. Part of me wanted to bolt back to the bathroom and lock the door. Another part of me knew that if I started running, I wouldn't be able to stop until morning. I listened again. Still nothing. No breathing, no movement. Just that same crushing silence. I forced myself to move. One step, then another. I stretched my hand out blindly, searching for the doorknob to my room. If I could just get back inside, get the door closed, I'd be fine. I told myself that over and over. Just get back to the room. Get inside. You're fine. My fingertips brushed something cool and metal. Relief flooded through me. The doorknob. I gripped it tightly, ready to twist it and throw myself inside. But before I could, that shadow moved again. Right in front of me. It came straight at me, fast and silent, and it was bigger now. It filled the space in front of me, looming dark, shapeless. Inches away from my face. I staggered back a half step, heart hammering wildly, breathing suddenly too loud in my ears. It felt like something was there. Not just a shadow anymore. A presence. Heavy and cold and real. I thought about yelling, waking the house up, letting them all know that something was wrong, that there was someone or something right there with me in the dark. My throat was tight with fear, my hands trembling. But I didn't. I stood there frozen, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. Another tiny movement. Closer. Right in front of my face. And then, without thinking, I lurched forward, hand outstretched, desperate to find something solid to anchor myself to. My nose bumped into something smooth and cold. I jumped back instinctively, heart skipping a beat, then reached out cautiously again, fingertips grazing the surface. It was glass. Confused, still half panicked, I felt around the edges. Flat, smooth, slightly cool from the night air. A frame. A wall. And then it hit me. The mirror. There was a mirror hanging on the wall, right next to my bedroom door. A big one, set at a 90-degree angle to the hallway. I knew it was there. I'd seen it 100 times during the day. But in the pitch dark, disoriented and scared out of my mind, I had completely forgotten. I hadn't made my second right turn at all. I was still facing straight down the hallway, right into the mirror. Every time I moved, the faint outline of my own body, my own movement, had been reflected back at me. In the darkness, with no light to help me make sense of it, it looked like a shadowy figure coming towards me, like something slipping silently out of the solid wood door of my room. It was just me. The wave of relief that crashed over me was so strong it made my knees weak. I sagged back against the wall, pressing the heels of my hands into my eyes and letting out a shaky breath. My whole body was still trembling. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing, feeling the coolness of the wall against my back, letting my heart rate slow down. Slowly, cautiously, I reached out again, found the edge of the mirror with my fingertips, and traced it to the corner. There, just a few steps away, was the real right-hand turn that would take me to my door. I turned, walked the few steps, and finally found the actual doorknob to my room. I twisted it, slipped inside, and closed the door behind me with a soft click. The faint light from my computer was still glowing, casting just enough illumination to make the room feel warm and familiar again. I stood there for a minute, leaning against the door, soaking in the simple safety of being back inside. I let out a long, slow breath. My muscles ached from how tense I'd been without even realizing it. When I finally moved, it was to walk over to my bed, collapse onto it, and stare up at the ceiling. I didn't even bother getting under the covers at first. I just lay there, breathing deeply, letting the last remnants of fear drain away. It was crazy how real it had felt, how easily my mind had turned a simple mistake into something terrifying. But that's how fear worked, wasn't it? It didn't need something real to latch onto. It just needed darkness, confusion, a racing heart. I stayed like that for a while, just listening to the soft hum of my computer and the quiet of the house around me. Eventually, when I felt calm enough, I got up, turned off my monitor, and crawled properly into bed. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow again, looming closer, reaching for me. Even though I knew now what it really was, the memory stuck with me,